There is a thought that arrives only at night and almost never in company. It comes when the house has gone quiet and you are lying still, and it says very simply, I could leave. Not forever, maybe, not even far, just out the door, down the road, into some plainer life where nobody needs anything from you. You have probably had that thought. Most people have. Most people let it drift past like a car passing on a far road, and by morning it is gone. In October of 1910, the most famous writer alive did not let it pass. Leo Tolstoy, 82 years old, the author of War and Peace and Anna Karenina, woke in the dark at his estate at Yasnaya Polyana, listened for a moment, and then got up and acted on the thought you and I have always released. He dressed by candlelight. He woke his doctor. He left a letter on the desk for his wife of 48 years. And he walked out of his own house before 5 in the morning, holding a small lantern, headed for the stables and a third-class train ticket and no real destination at all. He had 7 days left to live. He did not know that. Nobody knew that. Tonight we walk through those 7 days slowly, one at a time, the way you might walk through rooms of a house at night, touching the furniture to find your way. There is no hurry in this story. Nothing in it asks anything of you. You can let your body grow heavy while you listen. You can lose the thread and find it again an hour from now, or not find it at all, and the story will not mind. But here is the question that sits underneath everything you are about to hear, and it is worth holding loosely as you settle. What happens when a man spends 50 years teaching the whole world how to live simply, and cannot manage it inside his own front door? Not a trick question, not an accusation. A real question, the kind that has no clean answer, which is why it can keep a person company all night without ever raising its voice. Let your shoulders drop. Let the bed take your weight. You do not have to do anything with what you hear tonight. Near the end of this story, there is a window. A small house beside a railway line, lamplight on one side of the glass, and on the other side, standing in the cold, a woman who copied War and Peace by hand, page by page, more times than most of us have read it. She is not allowed inside. We will come back to that window. Hold it gently. It returns when it matters. For now, begin where he began. Not on the train, not at the station whose name the world would learn that November. Begin at the house, because the house explains the leaving, and nothing else does. Yasnaya Polyana sits about 120 miles south of Moscow in Tula province, among birch trees and orchards and long, low outbuildings. 2 round brick towers stand at the entrance to the drive, whitewashed, a little shabby, the paint always peeling somewhere. In 1910, the estate had a wooden main house painted white, an apple orchard of thousands of trees, a pond, a village of peasants whose grandparents had belonged, as property, to the writer's own grandfather. Tolstoy was born there in 1828 on a leather couch that stayed in the house his whole life. He wrote his greatest books there. He wanted at the end to be buried there, in a particular spot in the forest, for a particular reason we will come to. And for the last 30 years of his life, by his own account and by everyone else's, he was not at peace there. The house was comfortable, and the comfort accused him. The estate was beautiful, and the beauty had servants in it. Every meal arrived cooked by other hands, and the old man at the table had written over and over, in essay after essay read around the world, that a man should live by his own labor and own nothing he does not need. That is the knot. That is the whole 7 days, folded small. So let us take one step deeper. Chapter 2. The House That Held Two Men. Here is the detail that most tellings of this story rush past. There were, in a manner of speaking, 2 men living at Yasnaya Polyana under the one famous name, and they did not get along. The first man was Count Leo Nikolaevich Tolstoy, a Russian nobleman of old family. He owned land. He had inherited serfs in his youth, before the emancipation. He liked strong tea and rode a horse well into his 80s, a dark horse named Delia, and he had a nobleman's habits in 100 small ways he himself could list better than his critics could. This man had a wife, 13 children born to the marriage, a publishing fortune attached to his name, and a household that ran, as such households do, on the quiet work of cooks and coachmen and maids. The second man had appeared slowly over the course of the 1880s inside the body of the first. This man, dressed in a loose grey peasant blouse, belted at the waist. He learned from a village cobbler how to make boots, and made them, badly at first, at a small bench. He ploughed the fields beside the peasants, an old count sweating behind a horse while photographers more than once waited at the edge of the field. He gave up hunting, then meat, then tobacco. He came to believe that property was a form of violence, that governments rested on the whip, that the teaching of Jesus meant exactly what it said about giving everything away, and that his own royalties were a kind of stolen money. The first man built the house. The second man could not forgive the house for existing. You may know a milder version of this arrangement from the inside. Most of us are more than one person under our one name. There is the person who chose the life you are lying in tonight, the mortgage, the town, the work, the particular marriage, or the particular solitude. And there is the person who quietly asks, at intervals, whether any of it was ever the right shape. On good days, they share the house without friction. On bad days, one of them wants to repaint every room, or burn the house down and start again in a cabin somewhere. For Tolstoy, the friction was not mild, and it never resolved. Hold that gently, the 2 men under one name, because it returns later, near the end, when we ask which of them actually boarded the train. The room where the argument lived was his study, a plain desk, the leather couch he had been born on, kept like a relic. Shelves of Rousseau, whom he had worshipped since boyhood, and Schopenhauer, whom he had read with a kind of gloomy excitement one whole summer in his 40s, and the Gospels, marked and remarked in pencil. Visitors came from every continent to that room. By 1910, Yasnaya Polyana functioned as something between a shrine and a complaints office for the conscience of the world. Peasants walked up the drive asking for money. Students arrived asking how to live. An American might appear with a letter of introduction. then a Japanese journalist, then a barefoot pilgrim who had read that the Count fed wanderers. The Count did feed them, the Countess kept the accounts. There is a quieter layer beneath all this, and it is the one that matters for the night flight to come. The second Tolstoy, the one in the peasant blouse, had wanted for nearly 30 years to leave. Not to travel, to renounce, to walk out of the property, the fame, the contradiction, and live his last years in a hut, owning a coat and a spoon, consistent at last with every line he had published since his great change. He said so in letters. He said so in his diary year after year. In 1897 he even wrote a farewell letter to his wife, and then did not leave, and put the letter away in the upholstery of a chair where it sat, sealed, like a seed in dry ground, for over a decade. Why did he stay, decade after decade, in a house that hurt his conscience daily? Because of the other thing in the house, because of her. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. We are going back now, almost 50 years, to a summer evening in Moscow to meet the person this story is equally about. Chapter 3. The Green Stick and the Bride. First, though, the forest. You need the forest before you can understand either the marriage or the grave. At the edge of the estate at Yasnaya Polyana there is an old wood the family called the Zakaz, a stand of oaks and birches with a ravine running through it. When Tolstoy was 5 years old, his eldest brother Nikolai, who was 10, told the younger children a secret. He said he had written the secret of human happiness on a green stick and buried the stick at the edge of the ravine in the Zakaz forest. When the stick was found and the words were read, Nikolai said, "No one would ever be angry again. No one would suffer. Everyone would love one another." The children played at this for whole summers. They called themselves ant brothers, huddling under chairs draped with shawls, practicing tenderness the way other children practice war. Nikolai died of tuberculosis at 37 in his brother's arms in a rented room in the south of France. Tolstoy never recovered from it, and he never let go of the green stick. He wrote about it in his memoirs as an old man. He asked, quite specifically, to be buried at the place in the Zakaz where the stick was supposed to lie. Remember, the green stick. Of everything planted in this first hour, it is the seed that flowers last on the far side of the 7 days. Now the bride. In the summer of 1862, Tolstoy was 34, a bachelor landowner and rising writer with a gambling past, a war record from Sevastopol, and a reputation. The family of a Moscow doctor named Andrei Bears used to summer nearby, and the household included 3 daughters. The middle one, Sophia, called Sonia, was 18, dark-haired, quick, serious, a diary keeper like him, with an education and a temper and large, capable hands. That August, his visits became constant. The family assumed he would propose to the eldest sister, as convention required. He proposed by letter to Sophia. She read the letter in one breath and said yes. They married within weeks, in September 1862, and in the days before the wedding, Tolstoy did something that tells you nearly everything about the man and about the marriage to come. He handed his 18-year-old bride his bachelor diaries and required her to read them, all of them. The gambling debts, the drinking, the women, the serf woman on his own estate who had borne him a son. He believed a marriage must begin in total honesty, and so he emptied the whole grey sack of his past onto the lap of a teenager a week before her wedding. She read all night. She cried, by her own account, and she married him anyway, and something from those pages never fully left her. 16 years old when he first noticed her, 18 at the altar, and already she had learned the central rule of life with Tolstoy. He would always choose the truth as he saw it over anyone's comfort, including his own. Notice your breath for a moment. You do not need to change it. Just notice it moving without your help. The first years, by both their accounts, held real happiness. He wrote in his diary that he was so happy it frightened him. She ran the estate, bore child after child, and became something no other great writer has ever quite had. A full working partner in the physical making of the books. Every evening he handed her pages of War and Peace, scrawled, blotted, corrected up the margins and between the lines, and every night she sat copying them into a fair hand for the printers. The family story, told so often it became legend, says. She copied that immense novel 7 times over. Scholars soften the number, the truth of the labour nobody softens. 1,200 pages, again and again, by lamplight, pregnant more often than not, deciphering handwriting that sometimes only she in all of Russia could read. She was not a bystander to genius, she was its second pair of hands. Hold that picture, the two of them in one lamplit room, him writing, her copying, the greatest novel in the world passing between them like bread being kneaded. Whatever happens later in this story, and much happens, that room was real too. It was 1862, then 1869. The books grew, the family grew. Then, at 50, the floor under the whole enterprise gave way. Chapter 4. The Years of Copying. We will spend only a short time on the crisis at 50 because it is its own story for another night, and tonight belongs to the last 7 days. But you cannot understand the leaving without one paragraph on the break, so here is the paragraph. Around 1878, with Anna Karenina finished and the whole world calling him a master, Tolstoy fell into a despair so complete that by his own account he, a happy family man at the height of every power, hid a rope from himself and stopped carrying his gun on hunts so that the option would not be near his hand. The success meant nothing. The art meant nothing. Death cancelled everything in advance. He wrote his way out of it in a small, fierce book called A Confession, and came out the other side transformed, convinced that the meaning of life lay in faith as the peasants lived it, in labour, simplicity, and the plain teaching of the Gospels stripped of church gold. The American psychologist William James, a generation later, would hold Tolstoy up in The Varieties of Religious Experience as the very type of what James called the sick soul, the man who has to die inwardly and be born twice to go on living at all. That is the recap, and we leave it there. What matters tonight is what the second birth did to the house, because a conversion whatever else it is something that happens to a family. Sophia had married a novelist and a count. Somewhere in her 40s, she found herself married instead to a prophet who denounced the very ground she stood on. The property she managed, he now called sin. The royalties that fed and schooled their children, he now called stolen from the people. The church where she prayed, he attacked in print until in 1901 the Holy Synod formally cast him out, and she wrote a furious public letter defending him even so, because whatever the state of the marriage, nobody else was allowed to strike him. He wanted to give the land to the peasants and the books to the world. She had 8 living children. That sentence, held steady, is the whole domestic war in miniature. He was not wrong that the estate contradicted everything he taught. She was not wrong that renunciation is easy to preach when someone else keeps the ledgers. In 1891, they settled on a treaty that satisfied no one. He signed the estate over to his wife and children as if he had died, and gave the public the rights to everything he wrote after his conversion, while she kept the rights to the golden earlier books, War and Peace and Anna Karenina, and sold them to keep the family solvent. He got his clean hands, she got the account books and the blame. And here is the small detail that changes the picture. They could not stop loving each other and could not stop wounding each other, and the two activities used the same gestures. She still copied for him. He still read her his pages. On anniversaries they wrote tender things in their diaries, and a week later wrote despairing things. And both sets of entries were true. You may know this weather. Many long marriages hold decades in which love and grievance are not opposites, but roommates, sharing one small kitchen, taking turns at the stove. If your mind has wandered somewhere in these years, that is fine. The story holds. All you need from this chapter is one image: a woman at a lamplit table copying, by hand, page after page, the words of a man who has come to believe that everything the copying protects, the house, the income, the inheritance, is a sin against God. She kept copying anyway. The room does not answer. 40 years on from the wedding, the two of them, old now, still shared the white wooden house among the birches, bound by children and habit and history, and something neither of them ever agreed to call by one name. What broke the long stalemate at last was not an idea. It was a person. In the story of every strained family there is sometimes a third figure who arrives from outside and, without ever raising a voice, tips the whole structure. His name was Chertkov, and he is the next chapter. Chapter 5. The Disciple at the Gate. Vladimir Chertkov entered Tolstoy's life in 1883, and depending on which member of the household you asked, he was either the most devoted friend the old man ever had, or the coldest wind that ever came through the door. He was an aristocrat, a former officer of the Guards, tall, wealthy, handsome in the heavy way of his class, and he had undergone his own conversion to Tolstoy's teaching with the total commitment of a man who does nothing by halves. He gave up his career. He devoted his fortune and the rest of his life to collecting, editing, guarding, and publishing Tolstoy's words. When the government exiled him for years for spreading the forbidden writings, he ran the operation from England, printing what the censors banned. No one on earth, including Sophia, had read more of Tolstoy's private pages than Chertkov had. Tolstoy loved him. That is simply a fact of the story, and the fairest tellings do not flinch from it. In him the old man saw his ideas walking around in a body, unencumbered, undiluted, without the daily compromises that his own household forced on him. With Chertkov, he could be entirely the second Tolstoy, the prophet, and never the count. Now look at the same man through Sophia's window. A stranger arrives in the middle years of her marriage. Her husband gives this stranger the diaries, the manuscripts, the intimate papers that she has copied, sorted, and protected for decades, the archive that is also, not incidentally, her children's inheritance and her own life's work. The stranger builds a house nearby expressly to be close to her husband. The two men exchange letters and long looks and editorial decisions from which she is excluded. Everything she says against him confirms, in her husband's eyes, that she does not understand the teaching. Everything she does to reclaim the papers confirms it more. There is a shape here that family therapists would give a name to half a century later, and we will sit with that name properly in a later chapter, because it may be the most useful thing this whole story has to offer you. For now, just see the shape. Two people locked in a long, exhausting closeness, and a third point appearing, so that the current between the original two can root itself through him. Every family knows some version of the triangle. A child who becomes the battleground, a mother-in-law, a friend, a priest, a doctor. The fight stops being about the two people because it is safer to fight about the third. Let your jaw soften. None of this asks anything of you tonight. By 1910, the triangle had hardened into something close to siege warfare, conducted in whispers and diary entries. Sophia, now 66, was frightened in the particular way that reads from outside as fury. She searched for the diaries. She demanded Chertkov be kept from the house. She listened at doors. Her children took sides, most of the sons leaning toward her. The youngest daughter, Alexandra, called Sasha, devoted body and soul to her father and his cause. The doctors who came spoke carefully of nerves, of hysteria, the era's word for a woman's unbearable distress. A century later, we can say it more plainly and more kindly. She was a woman watching the meaning of her life being carried out of the house in another man's briefcase, and no one in the house could help her, least of all the man she was losing. And Tolstoy himself, in the middle, aging, writing in his diary that he was tormented on both sides. To please his wife was to betray his friend and, as he saw it, his teaching. To please his friend was to stab his wife. He was 81, then 82. He had heart trouble and fainting spells. And the two people he could not reconcile were fighting over what he loved most and trusted least, his own words. Here is the quieter layer beneath the whole conflict. Every one of these people believed they were protecting Leo Tolstoy, Sophia from exploitation, Chertkov from compromise, Sasha from her mother. Each of them was guarding a different Tolstoy, and there were enough of him to go around. What none of them could protect him from was the paper, because by the summer of 1910, the war had narrowed to a single document, and to get it signed, the old man would have to go into the forest like a conspirator. Chapter 6, The War of the Diaries. Before the forest, the diaries. You need to feel how strange the paper life of this family was, because the flight in October makes no sense without it. Everyone at Yasnaya Polyana kept a diary. Tolstoy had kept one since he was 18 and treated it as his laboratory and confessional, the place where the work on his own soul was done in full view of God and, as it turned out, of everyone else. Sophia kept hers, long, aching, precise. Sasha kept one, the doctor kept one, secretaries kept them, visitors went home and kept them. It has been said fairly that no dying in history was ever so thoroughly documented from so many angles at once, and the documenting began decades before the dying. But here is the thing about a house full of diaries. Nobody was writing only for themselves. Tolstoy knew Sophia would read his pages, hunting for his heart like a woman going through coat pockets. Sophia knew he knew and wrote her own entries partly as letters to the future, evidence for the great trial of posterity in which she expected, correctly, to be judged. He began keeping a small secret diary, hidden in his boot, for the thoughts even the regular diary could not hold. She found that one too. Imagine it for a moment, and imagine it gently, because both of them deserve gentleness here. Two old people, married almost half a century, each nightly writing an account of the other, each reading the other's account in secret, each wounded afresh every morning by pages composed at midnight. It was a marriage conducted in duplicate, once in the rooms and once on paper. And the paper version was crueler, the way written words always are, because they hold still and can be reread until they scar. There is a lesson folded in here that has nothing to do with Russia. The versions of the people we love that we compose at night, in the dark, in the privacy of our own heads, are always sharper and colder than the actual person asleep in the next room. Tolstoy and Sophia had the misfortune of writing those midnight versions down and leaving them where the other could find them. Most of us only think them. The kindness we manage in the morning is not hypocrisy. It is the truer record. In the last months, the fight over the papers reached a resolution so strange it could stand as the emblem of the whole marriage. The disputed diaries, decades of them, were gathered up and deposited for safekeeping in a bank vault in Tula. Think of it. The most intimate pages two people ever wrote about each other, boxed and receipted, held by clerks in a strongroom, like contested bonds, because the house that produced them could no longer be trusted to contain them. A marriage's inner life, in escrow. Feel the weight of the blanket on you. Let it press you slightly into the bed. The diaries mattered for one further reason, a hard, practical one: money. Tolstoy's post-conversion position was that his words belonged to everyone and no one, free for any publisher to print. Sophia's position was that the family's security rested on the copyrights, and that a man with grandchildren does not get to donate their bread to an idea. The diaries and manuscripts were the physical treasure over which this question would be settled, and whoever held the papers held the future. Chertkov held a great many of them. Sophia wanted them back, wanted them in a museum under her name, wanted, at bottom, written proof that the 50 years had counted for something. Through 1909 and into 1910, the pressure climbed. There were scenes at the table. There were nights Sophia lay in the garden in the cold, refusing to come in, and nights she threatened worse with the opium bottle with the pond, and the household learned to live on the alert, the way families of the desperate do. Modern readers sometimes ask which of them was the difficult one. The honest answer, the one their own children give in their memoirs, is that the question has no answer. Two people can each be having the hardest year of their life at the same time in the same house and be the cause of each other's. Hold that sentence a moment. It may be the most portable thing in this whole story. And in July of 1910, in secret, the old man ended the war on paper in the only place on the estate where no one could watch him do it. Chapter 7. A signature in the forest. The 22nd of July, 1910, by the old Russian calendar, which runs 13 days behind the one you know. All the dates in this story keep that old calendar, the one Tolstoy himself lived by. So when we say October, feel November's cold in it. On that July morning, Tolstoy rode out from the house as if for his usual ride, an old man on a dark horse, and turned into the woods near the village of Grumont. Waiting among the trees, by arrangement, were 3 witnesses and a draft document. One of the 3 was Alexander Goldenweiser, a concert pianist and devoted friend of the house, whose playing had soothed 100 difficult evenings at Yasnaya Polyana. The others were young men of the movement. They stood among the birches like seconds at a duel, watchful, out of place in their town coats, while the horses cropped the grass. The old man read the pages through once more, resting them on the wood, and the forest went about its business overhead. Then, in the green shade, using the flat top of a tree stump for a desk, Leo Tolstoy signed his last will and testament. Signed away, in effect, everything. The will left all his writings, the novels included, to his youngest daughter Sasha, not as an heiress, but as an instrument, because a separate agreement bound her to place everything in the public domain, with Chertkov as editor of the manuscripts. The books would belong to the world. No royalties, no family monopoly. The thing he had preached for 30 years, finally, irrevocably done. Done in a forest, done on a stump, done in hiding from his wife. He knew exactly what the hiding meant, and it tormented him. His diary in those weeks reads like the diary of a man doing right in a way that feels wrong, or wrong in a way that feels right, and unable to find the seam between. He believed, with reason, that if Sophia learned of the will, there would be no peace in the house again in his lifetime. He was correct. She learned that some such document existed, though not its terms, within weeks. The not knowing was its own poison. All through August and September she searched and wept and raged and appealed to the children, and the more she searched, the more the household closed against her, and the more it closed, the more frantic she became. Fear does that. It manufactures the very abandonment it dreads. If you want a single week where the leaving became inevitable, historians point here to the will in the forest, 3 months before the train. After July, there were 2 facts in the house that could not share a roof forever. A wife who would not stop until she found the truth, and a husband who could not survive her finding it. Notice your breath again, in and out. Nothing to fix. It is worth pausing on the stump itself, because the scene is so strange it becomes a kind of parable, and different people in the house read it as different parables. For Chertkov, it was the teaching triumphant. Truth signed in God's own woods, free of the corrupt house. For Sophia, when she pieced it together later, it was betrayal in its purest form, half a century of marriage overturned in secret among strangers on a stump. For Sasha, it was a sacred trust laid on her young shoulders. And for the old man riding home through the trees, it seems to have been mostly relief and the beginning of the last stretch of dread. He wrote around then a thought he had carried for years, that he wished to go away, to disappear into the simple world, and that he was held by love and by pity and could not tell any more which of the two was the chain. An old man, a stump, a signature, 4 people, each certain of what it meant. The paper was signed. The house did not know it yet, but it was already burning slowly from the inside, the way peat burns underground all winter. All that remained was the spark, and the spark took 3 more months. Chapter 8. The Last Summer. Let us slow down here, because these are the last months the two of them will ever live in one house, and they deserve better than a summary. Through the late summer of 1910, Yasnaya Polyana held a strange double weather. Outside, the estate did what it always did in August. Apples ripening in the great orchard, peasants mowing, guests arriving with cameras. Inside, the household kept watch over Sophia, whose distress had become an illness with no undamaged name. She wept through nights, she accused, she begged. She searched her husband's study when he was out riding, feeling under cushions, reading whatever she found. Doctors were summoned from Moscow, spoke of paranoia and nerves, prescribed rest, and left. The sons came and went, worried, useless, drawn back into the general unhappiness that a childhood home in crisis exerts on grown children, a gravity you may have felt at some point in your own life, pulling you back into a house where everyone resumes their oldest role within the hour. Tolstoy's own diary, that autumn swings between tenderness and despair in the space of single entries. He pitied her terribly, that is, on nearly every page. He also, on the same pages, felt himself suffocating, twice before he had come to the very edge of leaving. Back in 1884, after a quarrel, he had actually walked out with a pack on his back, gotten partway down the road to Tula, and turned around because Sophia was in labor that same night with their daughter Sasha, and even his despair could see what leaving a woman in childbirth would mean. He came home. The bag stayed half-packed for the rest of the decade, so to speak. And in 1897, he had written the farewell letter that went into hiding instead of into her hands. The letter that said he was doing what old men of his age often did, leaving the worldly life to go quietly toward God. So the thought of flight was not new. It was 26 years old, worn smooth like a stone kept in a pocket. What changed in October was that the pocket wore through. 2 small mercies first, because the record holds them and fairness wants them, said. In those very last weeks there were still hours of the old life. She still sat with him. There is testimony of her caring for him in his fainting spells that September with the practiced terror of a woman who had nursed him for decades. On their last wedding anniversary, the 23rd of September, she asked him to stand for a photograph beside her, and he did, stiff, kind, remote, an old couple side by side in the sun. It is the last photograph of them together. If you ever see it, you will notice her hand, how it rests near his arm without quite claiming it. Hold that photograph in the dark for a second. Two people who had made 13 children and several immortal books, standing in a garden, no longer able to reach each other across 6 inches of September air. The stone in the pocket, wearing through. By late October, the nights had turned cold and the house had shrunk to its lit rooms. Around him, the old man had his allies. Sasha, fierce and 26, her friend Varvara Feokritova, serving as secretary, and the household doctor, a gentle, exact Slovak named Dusan Makovitsky, who had given up his own life to serve Tolstoy, and who recorded everything, hour by hour, in a notebook history is still grateful for. Around her, Sophia had almost no one. That asymmetry matters. Whatever else the last night was, it was not a fair fight between equal camps. It was an old man with helpers and an old woman with fears, and a house in which every door had learned to close quietly. On the night of the 27th of October, one of those doors opened. We are almost at the beginning now. If your thoughts have been drifting among your own rooms and your own years, that is fine. Come back gently, or do not come back at all, and let the story go on below you like water under a boat. Either way, we are here, at the last night in the house. Chapter 9, Footsteps in the Study. The night of the 27th of October, 1910, was cold and moonless at Yasnaya Polyana, the roads already half mud, half frost. The house went to bed at its usual hours. Tolstoy had spent the evening quietly. He had played cards with the household earlier in the week, worked at letters, gone up carrying his candle. Sophia had retired late. The doors closed quietly, as they had learned to do. Sometime around 3 in the morning, the old man woke in his plain bedroom with its iron bed and its washstand, and heard a sound through the wall, papers. The soft, unmistakable rustle of someone going through papers in his study, and beneath it, footsteps trying not to be footsteps. A line of light under the door. It was Sophia, searching again, hunting in the drawers of his desk for the will, or for the diary, or simply for the truth of where she stood at 3 in the morning in her night clothes, in the 67th year of her life and the 49th year of her marriage. If you have ever lain awake listening to another person move through a dark house, you know that sounds at that hour arrive without their explanations. Whatever is generous in you sleeps first. What is left interprets. He lay there, his heart, by his own account, pounding out of rhythm, and something in him finished. Not anger exactly, though anger was in it. In his diary, he called the feeling unbearable, and he named it disgust, indignation, and underneath those, a strange, calm certainty. The kind that comes when a long-argued question suddenly answers itself. She searched for perhaps an hour and went back to bed, knowing nothing. And the house was still again, and in the stillness, the oldest thought he owned, The stone, worn smooth by 26 years of carrying, came out of its pocket for the last time. Leave, not in 1884, when the road bent him back to a woman in labour, not in 1897, when the letter went into hiding instead. Now, tonight. Before the light came, and the arguments woke up, and love and pity reattached their chain. If your mind has been drifting, that is fine. Come back gently. We are still here, in the dark house, at the turning point of the whole story, and it is only 3:15. He lit his candle. He sat on the edge of the bed, an old man with a white beard down his chest, and made the decision that the world's newspapers would be shouting about within 48 hours, though the room where it happened held nothing louder than a clock. It is worth pausing on how small the scene is. History likes to happen in squares and palaces, but an enormous share of it happens exactly here, in a bedroom at 3 a.m, when one exhausted person stops being able to do the thing they have always done. No witnesses, no speech. Just a candle flame steadying itself, and a man listening one more time to make sure the house was asleep. He would be dead in 10 days. Every step from this candle forward is a step in that direction, and he takes each one believing he is walking at last toward life. Let your shoulders drop again. Let the bed hold you. The house is quiet now, and an old man is putting on his boots, and we will go down the corridor with him. There is one more thing to see before he wakes the others, and it is the thing his own account insists on. Standing there in the candlelight, he was afraid. Afraid of her waking. Afraid of the scene that would follow, the weeping, the reproaches, his own pity, which he did not trust, because pity had always been the chain that held. An 82-year-old man, one of the most famous human beings on the planet, tiptoeing in his own house, frightened of the sound of a door. Whatever judgment you are tempted toward, either of them, hold it loosely tonight. Fear at 3 a.m. is a country everyone has visited. He simply decided, this once, not to spend the rest of the night there. He crossed the corridor. He knocked, very softly, at the doctor's door. Chapter 10. 3 a.m. Dusan Makovitsky woke instantly, the way doctors do. Years afterward, people would ask him about that knock, and his notebooks, kept almost minute by minute, are one of the main reasons we can walk through this night at all. The old man stood in the doorway with his candle and said he was leaving for good, and that Makovitsky was to come with him, and that they must move quietly and quickly. The doctor did not argue. That was his character, and also his creed. He believed in Tolstoy the way other men believed in scripture, and if the teacher said the hour had come, then the hour had come. He began to pack medical things, warm things, sensible things, his hands doing the work while the household's fate rearranged itself around him. They woke Sasha and her friend Varvara. Picture the scene with its exact textures. Candles moving in windows at 3:30, drawers eased open an inch at a time, the four of them whispering in the study where, 2 hours earlier, Sophia's own candle had moved. Sasha, 26 years old, half terrified and half exalted, helping her father escape her mother. Whatever else this night is, do not lose how strange it is, and how sad that the machinery of a family can arrive at such a place by increments, each one of which felt, at the time, like the only possible step. Tolstoy himself packed little: a fur coat against the cold, some manuscripts. He was leaving behind the house, the library, the couch he had been born on. But first, before anything else could happen, he sat down at his desk and did the most Tolstoyan thing imaginable at 4 a.m, he wrote. The letter he left for Sophia survives, and because it was later published to the whole world, we can stand close to it, though tonight we will stand respectfully and paraphrase. In substance, it said this: that his going would grieve her and he was sorry for it, but that she should understand and believe he could not do otherwise. That his position in the house had become unbearable, and that he could no longer live in the luxury in which he had lived. That he was doing what old men of his age had always done, leaving the worldly life behind to spend his last days in quiet and solitude. That he asked her not to come after him, not to search for him, not to be angry, and that he thanked her, plainly and by the number, for their 48 years of honest life together, and asked her forgiveness for everything he had been guilty of toward her, as he forgave, with his whole soul, whatever she had been guilty of toward him. Held one way, it is a cruel letter because it closes a half-century with a locked door. Held another way, it is as tender as the man could afford to be while still getting out the door at all. Both readings are true, and they do not cancel. He dated it the 28th of October and signed it, and then, characteristically, could not quite leave it alone. Lines were added about practical things, the habit of half a century of sharing a household asserting itself inside the very letter that ended it. He folded it, and it waited on the desk for morning like a small white stone. Breathe once, slowly. There is no hurry here. The candles are moving downstairs now. It was around 4, perhaps a little after. Outside, the night was black in the way country nights were black in 1910. No glow anywhere. The orchard a wall of darker dark. The plan, so far as there was one, was only this: reach the stables, harness the horses, drive the few miles to the little railway station at Sciocchino, and take the first morning train away. Away where, exactly, no one had settled. South, vaguely, toward his sister's convent, perhaps, first. The point was not a destination. After 30 years of wanting out, the door itself was the destination. An old man in a fur coat picked up a small lantern and stepped out alone into the dark, ahead of the others, to find his own way to the stables. Chapter 11. The Lantern and the Stables. The path to the stables ran through the orchard, a walk of a few minutes in daylight. In the pitch dark of that October morning, it became, briefly, a wilderness. The lantern blew out, or gave too little light to matter. The accounts agree on the darkness and disagree on the details, which is what honest accounts do. What we know is that the old man lost the path. He strayed among the apple trees, his hat knocked from his head by a branch, or dropped and not found, mud pulling at his boots, thorn and twig plucking at the famous coat. For some minutes, The author of War and Peace wandered lost in his own orchard, 100 steps from the house he had lived in for 8 decades, bareheaded in the freezing dark, groping from trunk to trunk. He found his way by the lit window of the stable block, or was found. Again, the tellings differ, and we flag it and move on. What no telling omits is the fear that ran under those minutes. If he fell here, if the heart gave out here, the whole flight would end as a household accident, an old man discovered at dawn among the trees. When at last he reached the stables and the light, he stood catching his breath among the warm smells of horse and straw, while the coachman, roused and bewildered, began to harness by lantern light. Makovitsky, arriving with the bags, did what he always did. He took the old man's pulse. It was racing, near 100 skipping beats. The doctor said nothing that survives. There was nothing to say. You cannot prescribe rest to a man in the act of escaping his life. And the only medicine on hand that mattered, the warm coat, the rugs, the flask of coffee, was already being loaded into the carriage. The horses shifted and blew unhurried, the only creatures in the yard to whom this night was ordinary. There is a painting quality to this scene that the newsreels and the biographies all felt, and it is worth letting your mind's eye rest in it a moment, because it will not slow down again for days. Lantern light on wet cobbles, horses stamping, breath steaming. 2 figures hurrying down from the house with bags. Sasha's candle in an upstairs window, guarding the corridor where her mother slept. And in the middle of it, the old man, hatless, already looking, as Makovitsky's notes suggest, both exhausted and lighter than he had looked in months. Fugitives are usually running towards something they want or away from something they fear. He was doing both at once, which may be why no single word, escape, desertion, pilgrimage, has ever quite fit this night, though the world would try them all within the week. They brought him a fresh hat. They tucked rugs around him against the cold. Somewhere between 5 and 6 in the morning, the carriage rolled quietly out past the 2 white entrance towers of Yasnaya Polyana. Wheels loud on the frozen ruts, and turned down the road towards Shchokino station. He did not look back at the house, or he did. No one thought to record it, and tonight we can let the omission stand as its own small mercy. Feel the weight of your own body where it lies. You are warm and still and going nowhere, which is its own quiet luxury. Let the story do the travelling. At the station they were early, and the waiting was its own ordeal. Every minute on the platform was a minute in which pursuit could arrive, and the old man paced and watched the road, his pulse, the doctor noted, running unevenly. Country stations at dawn are gentle places. A stove in the waiting room, a clerk behind a grill, milk cans on a cart, and this one held, that morning, the century's most famous fugitive, muffled to the beard, glancing at the road like a boy running from school. When the train came at last, iron and steam out of the grey light, they took their seats and the platform slid away, and Yasnaya Polyana was behind him. He would never see it again. In the letter on the desk, morning was coming. Chapter 12, The Letter on the Desk. We have to go back to the house now. The train can wait. Trains in this story always wait. What happened at Yasnaya Polyana that morning has to be told, and it has to be told carefully. because it is the hardest passage in these 7 days, and because Sophia deserves to have it told with her dignity intact. She woke late for her. The house had held its breath all morning. Sasha had stayed behind expressly to manage this hour. When Sophia asked where her husband was, she was given the letter. She read it standing, and the accounts say she did not finish it before she understood, because the first lines carried it all: departure, grief, do not follow. 48 years, 13 children born, 5 of them buried, each small coffin a place where the 2 of them had stood together. The manuscripts copied by lamplight, the estate managed through wars and famines, the public letter she wrote against the Holy Synod when they cast him out, the whole architecture of a life built around one enormous man, and the man was gone, out the door in the dark, leaving a page in his own hand asking her, in substance, not to look for him. What she did next, the household had feared for years, which is why hands and eyes were already near her. She went out, through the cold garden, to the pond, the middle pond where the family had swum in summer, and she went into the grey water. She meant it as the only sentence loud enough for her grief. With drowning, the 2 are sometimes the same thing, and we are not required to decide. Sasha and the others were there within moments. They brought her out, soaked and freezing and alive, and got her to the house and dried her, and from that hour on she was watched day and night by her children and the servants, the way you watch a candle in a house made of paper. The pond settled back to stillness. The house did not. Let that scene rest now. Set it down gently, the way you would set down something breakable that belongs to someone else. She lived, and she will be at the center of this story again before it ends, standing at a lit window in the cold, and tonight we will stand out there with her and do her the justice. The newspapers of 1910 mostly did not, because here is what the world's press made of her in the coming week, and it should be said plainly so we can refuse it together. They made her the shrew, the great man fled. It was a simple story, and it sold. A saint in a peasant blouse, a grasping wife, a door slamming. Even some in the household told it that way. But you have been in this house with her all evening. You have seen the 18-year-old handed the bachelor diaries, the young mother copying 1,200 pages by candle, the aging woman fighting alone against a disciple with a briefcase for the papers that proved her life had mattered. A 50-year marriage ending in mutual incomprehension is a tragedy with 2 people in it. It does not need a villain, and tonight it will not be given one. That evening, watched and spent, she took up the diary she had kept for most of her life and wrote in it. The entry for that terrible day survives with all the others. She set down the fact of the letter and the fact of the pond in her own hand, because recording the family's life was her office, and she kept the office even now. And there is a kind of terrible faithfulness in that which needs no commentary from anyone. Notice your breath. Let it be slow. The hard part of this night is behind us now. By noon, telegrams were flying from the estate to the grown children in Moscow. Father has left, come. By the next day, somehow the story reached the newspapers, and the private catastrophe of one family became, within about a day, the public property of the reading world. Where has Tolstoy gone? Every editor in Russia wanted the answer by morning. The answer at that moment was third class, heading south by way of a monastery. And that is where we rejoin him. Chapter 13, Third Class. He rode third class by choice. Understand that, and you understand half of what this flight was for. There had been money enough in the party for better seats, and a man of his years and heart trouble had every medical excuse. But the whole point of the leaving, the point he had been failing to reach for 30 years, was to stop living behind glass. The peasants he had spent his life praising rode on wooden benches in cars that smelled of sheepskin, cheap tobacco, bread and bodies. And so that is where the Count would ride. Pressed in among them at last, one old man in a crowd of ordinary Russia. The first stretch from Shchokino was quiet enough. The trouble began after they changed trains at the junction at Gorbakyovo for the line toward Kozelsk. The car they boarded was third class in full reality, packed, loud, the air thick with smoke, and the iron stove going hard against the October cold, condensation running down the windows. Makovitsky, ever the doctor, saw at once what a sealed, hot, crowded box means for an old man's lungs, and could do nothing about it, because his patient was, for the first time in years, exactly where he wanted to be. And here is the detail that decides everything later, though no one could know it yet. The heat and the closeness grew too much, and Tolstoy went out to stand on the open platform at the end of the car, in the wind, in his coat, watching the fields go by for perhaps an hour, maybe more. The air out there was free and cold and moving. It was also, for an 82-year-old chest, a slow gamble with the weather, and the weather does not lose those. If the fever that ends this story has a doorway, most tellings put it here, on the swaying platform of a third-class car between Gorbakyovo and Kozelsk, an old man breathing October in and calling it freedom. Makovitsky came out twice to stand with him, a scarf in his hands, a suggestion on his face. The old man waved the scarf away, gently, the way he had waved away a lifetime of protections. He was watching the country go by, the stubble fields, the grey villages, the horses standing in the mud, the Russia he had written into permanence, sliding past a third-class railing in the cold, moving air. Because that is the cruelty folded into this part of the story, and there is no way around it. The leaving itself is what killed him. The doctors will say pneumonia, and the calendars will say November, but the arithmetic is plain. He fled the safe, warm house that was suffocating his soul, and the fleeing gave his body more truth than it could carry. You can hear that as a warning against leaving, or as the price of a real life honestly paid at last. And people have argued it both ways for a century. Tonight you do not have to choose. The old man on the platform did not think he was choosing death. He thought he was breathing. Let your hands go loose wherever they are lying. Nothing here needs holding. Inside the car, meanwhile, something else had begun, quietly. The thing that would swallow the whole last week. Recognition. It started, as it always starts, with one long look. A passenger stares at the old man, with the white beard a moment too long, leans to a neighbour. The neighbour looks. In 1910, There was no more recognizable face in Russia, perhaps in the world. That beard, those brows under a soft cap, had been photographed, painted, printed on postcards, projected in lecture halls. A murmur moved down the benches, the way wind moves down a wheat field. It is him. It cannot be. It is him. The word went ahead, as word does, faster than the train. At the little stations down the line, people began to appear on the platforms, not crowds yet, but clusters, standing in the cold to watch the carriage windows go by. Somewhere in those hours, though the family did not yet know where he was, the fact of him became public property in motion. He had left home to disappear into ordinary Russia. Ordinary Russia looked up from its bundles and its benches and knew him on sight. He could leave the house, he could not leave the face. Chapter 14. The Talk in the Carriage. But before the crowds, before the wires and the cameras, there was one long conversation on those benches, and Makovitsky wrote it down, and it deserves its own chapter, because it is the last picture of Tolstoy being simply what he had always been at his best, a mind in love with talking to strangers. The company on the benches was the company of any Russian local train of the period. Peasants with sacks, a couple of workmen, tradespeople, and one educated man, a land surveyor who was not shy. When it was clear beyond doubt who the old passenger was, the surveyor did what educated men do and opened a debate. And the old man, who had fled his study before dawn, hatless and heartsick, lit up like a stove. They went at the great questions, the ones he had spent decades writing about. The land question above all, how the earth should be held, whether any man could rightly own the ground another man must live from. Tolstoy laid out, with an admirer's warmth, the scheme of the American economist Henry George, the single tax on land, the idea that land value belongs to everyone and rent to no one, a doctrine he had pressed on ministers and czars in open letters and never stopped believing might spare Russia the storm he felt coming. They argued about science, about schooling, about faith. Third-class passengers drifted down the car to listen, standing in the aisle, swaying with the train. For an hour or two, a wooden carriage rattling through Tula province became the last lecture hall of a man whom universities across the world had begged to visit. The listeners gave as well as took. Someone passed bread. Someone poured tea from a kettle filled at a station tap, and he drank it among them, and the accounts of the carriage agree that nobody fawned. They argued back. A peasant contradicted him about the land, out of experience, and he took the contradiction with open delight because being argued with as an equal was precisely the thing his fame had been starving him of for 30 years. Here is the small human thing to keep from this scene. He was happy, witnesses agree on it. Tired, ill, 82, one day out from the wreck of his household, and happy, arguing land tax with a surveyor while peasants listened. Some people are most themselves in a pulpit, some in a study. He was most himself in conversation with strangers who owed him nothing where nothing was owed back, no marriage, no discipleship, no ledger, only the free trade of minds. You may know someone like this, warmest at one remove, best with strangers, hardest on the people closest in. It is one of the more common shapes a good heart comes in. It is a costly shape for a family, and the cost was being counted that same hour back at a house beside a pond. Hold that gently. Both things are true at once, and this story keeps asking you to hold true things in pairs. The train worked its slow way toward Kozelsk through the afternoon. He rested, the talk ebbed. Stations passed with their lamps coming on early in the grey weather. And you can feel, reading the notebooks, the little party's plan taking its vague shape. First, to Optinapustin, the famous monastery near Kozelsk, a place he had gone at earlier crossroads of his life. Then to Shamodino, the convent nearby, where his last living sibling, his sister Maria, was a nun. After that, south, somewhere south, the Caucasus perhaps, warmth, obscurity, a hut, a village, some final simple chapter that existed so far only as a feeling. An old man riding toward a monastery with no plan beyond his sister's face. The world would call it a pilgrimage, a flight, a scandal, a breakdown. On the benches that evening it looked like what it was, a tired traveller dozing between stations, done with one life and not yet arrived in another. If your own thoughts are loosening now, let them. The train runs on without your attention, and the next stop is a quiet one. They reached Kozelsk after dark and hired horses and drove through the night mud to the monastery gates. Chapter 15. The Monastery Path. Optinapustin stood and stands on the far bank of a small river outside Kozelsk. White walls, a bell tower, a scatter of gold onion domes above bare October trees. For most of the 19th century, it was the beating heart of Russian spiritual life, famous for its elders, monks of deep counsel to whom the whole country brought its wounds. Gogol had come. Dostoevsky came in his grief after his small son died, and put what he found there into the elder Zosima of the brothers Karamazov. And Tolstoy had come more than once in the crises of his middle life, arguing with the elders and being drawn back all the same. Now he came again, at the very end, an excommunicated man knocking at the church's most beloved door. They took rooms at the monastery's guest house for the night, and the next morning, the 29th of October, there occurred one of the quietest and most argued over scenes in the whole 7 days. Tolstoy walked out alone toward the Sket, the enclosure apart from the main monastery where the elders lived, where the elder Joseph was old and ill, and the elder Varsonofy received the wounded of Russia. He walked the path under the pines. He came near the gate. He slowed. He turned around and walked back, and did not knock. Later, at the guest house, he said he would gladly have talked with the elders, but he could not make the approach. He was excommunicated, and, as he put it in substance, they might not receive him, and the humiliation of being turned from the door or the compromise of seeming to repent what he still believed, both were more than the old heart could stage manage. So he stood in the cold within sight of the gate, the most famous religious dissident on earth, wanting comfort from the very church he had spent 30 years dismantling in print and pride or integrity or shyness, history cannot fully sort them, walked him back down the path. That evening, back at the guest house, he said something to his companions that Makovitsky preserved, and it is worth carrying towards sleep. He said, in substance, that he would gladly live out his days at Optina, taking on the humblest work the monastery had, if only they would not require of him the rites he could not honestly perform. The lowest chores, gladly, the smallest lie, impossible. Whatever one finally makes of his doctrines, that sentence is the man entire. He walked by the river a while before supper. An old man among the bare willows, watched from a distance by monks who did not approach. The gate did not open. It was never asked to. Sit with that image a moment, because it may be the truest portrait of him in this whole story. Not the prophet thundering in essays, not the count in the peasant blouse. Just an old man on a pine path wanting to knock and not knocking. Nearly everyone carries a door like that. A telephone number never dialed, a letter drafted and not sent, a driveway pulled past instead of into, a name we cannot say aloud in a certain house. The distance between wanting and knocking can stay 3 steps wide for 30 years. His stayed 3 steps wide until the end of his life. And if the story of the last days has one recurring figure, it is this: doors approached and not entered, until the final one at a railway station, which other people will decide for him. Notice your breath. In, out. There is no door here tonight. Only the bed and the dark, and a story getting quieter as it goes. That afternoon they drove on 10 miles or so of jolting road to the convent at Chamordino, a big plain community of hundreds of nuns that Optina's elders had founded for peasant women, women with no dowries, the poor, the widowed, the blind. His sister had lived there for 2 decades. Of all the thresholds in Russia, this was the one where he could be certain, absolutely certain, of the welcome. And for one evening, he got it. Chapter 16, his sister's table. Maria Nikolaevna was the last of them. Of the 5 children who had played ant brothers under the shawl-draped chairs, who had hunted the green stick at the edge of the ravine, only she and Leo were left, and she had ended her wandering after a stormy life of her own as a nun at Chamordino. She was 80, he was 82. When he appeared in her doorway that evening, unannounced, mud-spattered, half the world already looking for him, she did what a sister does. She gave him tea and let him talk. He told her everything, by her later account. The search of the study, the night departure, the letter, the pond, which he had learned of by now through telegrams to the party. He wept at that. The record is clear that news of what Sophia had tried to do had shaken him hard. Alone with the one person on earth who had known him since the nursery, who predated the fame, the marriage, the doctrine, all of it, he was not a prophet or a count or a scandal. He was her little brother Lyovochka, old and frightened, and asking in effect whether he had done a terrible thing or a necessary one, and hearing, as one does at the very best tables, no verdict at all, only company. They spoke of the old things too. The accounts say the evening reached back past all the wreckage into the nursery years. The 5 of them once, now 2. The games in the zakaz, the brothers long buried, the mother neither of them could remember, and both of them had spent a lifetime missing. 2 white heads at a lamplit table, keeping the only living archive of a vanished household between them. Every family arrives at such a table eventually. Two rememberers, where a crowd once was. If you are still awake, this is the part I wanted you to hear. Not the famous deathbed ahead, but this. Two people in their 80s drinking tea in a convent cell. One of them the most argued about man alive, and the argument nowhere in the room. Every life, however tangled, keeps a few chairs like that one. Chairs where explanation is unnecessary. They are usually the oldest chairs we have. That is worth something to remember on any night. Fame reaches almost everywhere, but it could not get into his sister's room. Weather cannot reach that deep. He stayed the next day, and, for a day, the plan changed shape and became almost gentle. He walked into the village by the convent and looked at a hut that was offered for rent, a peasant izba, and talked, seriously it seems, of wintering there. Consider it. Tolstoy in a rented hut at the gates of his sister's convent, chopping his own wood at the edge of a community of praying women near Optina's bells, unreachable and at peace. It was the whole 30-year dream in miniature, and for a few hours on the 30th of October, it sat on the table like a set of keys, and no one will ever know quite how close he came to picking it up, because at that point the world caught up with him. Sasha arrived from Yasnaya Polyana that evening with her friend Varvara, bringing love, bags and terror. The news she carried, her mother's state, the pond, the watching, the brothers gathering, and, decisive above all, the fact that his location was no longer secret. The newspapers had the scent. Sophia, the family feared, would learn where he was within a day, and come by the first train, and the scene he had fled Yasnaya Polyana at 5 a.m. to avoid would simply be restaged at Shamordino, in front of his sister, in front of the nuns, in front of God and the press. The hut went back to being a hut. Long after midnight, in his room at the convent guest house, the old man sat writing to Sophia, a letter he would never finish. And before 4 a.m, he woke his companions once more and said, again, now, quickly, before she comes. The last door in Russia where he was safe. And once again the knock he feared was hers, coming toward him. So he opened the door himself and walked out into the dark ahead of it. Chapter 17. Leaving before dawn again. So the flight resumed, and this second leaving was harder than the first. The first had adrenaline in it and 30 years of rehearsal. The second was an old man being pried out of the one warm room left to him. Before 4 a.m. on the 31st of October, the little party, 4 of them now, Tolstoy, Sasha, Varvara, and the faithful Makovitsky, climbed into hired carriages in the black cold and jolted the miles back to Kozelsk station. He had not said goodbye to his sister. There had been no time or no strength, and a note had to stand in for the parting. Maria Nikolaevna, by the accounts of those at the convent, grieved that he had gone without her blessing on his head. The last 2 aunt brothers had sat at one table for a single evening and would not meet again in this life. At Kozelsk, in the dark, they boarded a train heading south and east, and now, for the first time, the flight had something like a written plan. Tickets were taken for Rostov-on-Don, 700 miles away. The notion, half-formed, ran like this. First to Novocherkassk, where a niece lived, and there perhaps foreign passports, and on to Bulgaria if the papers could be got. If not, then the Caucasus, the mountains of his young manhood, where the sect of spirit wrestlers he admired had communities, and where an old man might vanish into the warm south the way a stone vanishes into deep grass. It had the sound of a plan. It had distances in it, and a map. What it did not have was any allowance for the passenger's body. He had slept an hour or two in 3 days. He was 82 with a damaged heart, and he had spent one of those days breathing wind on an open platform. As the train ran south through the morning of the 31st, the people opposite him watched the old face grow duller, the great frame settle lower into the coat. He took some coffee, dictated a little, dozed. The carriage was another crowded one, hot again, close again. Around noon he complained of the chill that is never only a chill. There is a quieter layer under this stretch of the story, and you may have felt it already. From the outside, the journey now looks less like an escape and more like a man being handed, station by station, from one mercy to the next. His sister's table, the doctor's watchfulness, strangers' kindness, and, waiting a few hours down the line, the last mercy, wearing a railwayman's cap. He thought he was steering. Increasingly, he was being carried. Perhaps you have had a season like that in your own life, a time when your plans quietly became passengers alongside you while events drove. Old age is often described that way by those inside it. It is frightening only from the front. From within, many report, there arrives a strange rest in it, the rest of a child in a back seat at night, going somewhere, carried by others, headlights opening the dark a little at a time. Let your body be carried now by the bed, the way he was carried by that train. Nothing is required of you. The wheels turn on their own. And remember the window. The one I promised you at the beginning, lamplight on one side, a woman in the cold on the other. We are getting closer to it now, closer with every mile this train makes to the south. The window is at a place none of the 4 travellers had ever heard of that morning. A coaling stop on the Ryazan-Ural line, a nothing of a place, a water tower and a telegraph office, and a scatter of railway houses on the steppe. By early afternoon, Makovitsky had the thermometer out. The reading was over 100 and climbing. Chapter 18. The fever on the train. Fever in an old body is weather of its own kind. It came up over him the way storm cloud comes up over flat country, visibly from a distance, with everyone watching and nothing to be done. Through the afternoon of the 31st, the temperature rose past 101, past 102 by evening measures, and the shivering began, the great frame shaking under the rugs they piled on him. Makovitsky, who loved him, and was also the one man in the carriage seeing him purely as a patient, understood before anyone said it. Pneumonia, coming on fast in a man of 82, on a moving train, in October, hundreds of miles from anywhere prepared to receive him. The doctor's notebooks stay calm on the page, doctor's notebooks do, but the arithmetic in them is the arithmetic of an emergency. Understand what pneumonia meant in 1910, in a world without the medicines your own century leans on. There was no drug that touched it. There was nursing, warmth, camphor for the heart, and the patient's own reserves. And in the old, it won so reliably and so quietly that the doctors of that generation called it the old man's friend, the soft-footed visitor that comes at the end and does not linger. Makovitsky knew all of this as he folded away the thermometer. The man beside him had a will that was the stuff of legend, and lungs that were 82 years old, and the two were about to be weighed against each other in whatever bed the timetable offered. They conferred in whispers over the sleeping head. Rostov was out of the question, a night and a day away. Even the next junction town might be too far. The rule in such cases is the oldest rule of travel with the sick. Stop at the next place with a bed. The next place with a bed, said the railway timetable, was a station called Astapovo, due in the early evening. Say the name to yourself once, softly, the way the world was about to learn it. Astapovo. 4 syllables of step, railway, nothing. It served the coal line. Trains took water there. A few hundred souls, most of them railway families, lived around the yards. It had no town behind it, no monastery, no history. Of all the destinations argued over in the last week, Yasnaya, Polyana, Optina, Shamordino, Bulgaria, the Caucasus, the place where the story actually stops, was chosen by a thermometer and a timetable. Destiny, up close, usually looks exactly like this. Not a summons, but a connection missed, a fever, the next stop on the board. Hold that gently, because there is comfort in it if you turn it right. We spend great effort steering our lives, and much of the steering is real. But the places that end up mattering most are so often the unchosen ones, the waiting rooms, the wrong towns, the borrowed beds, the rooms we were only passing through when life caught up with us. If it can be true of the most deliberate man in Russia, it is allowed to be true of you and me. The train slowed in the last grey light of the 31st of October. Astapovo, lamps just lit, a water tower black against the sky, a small station building and its scatter of wooden houses, the smell of coal smoke and frost. The conductor had been told there was a sick old man aboard. Word went along the platform ahead of the opening doors, the way word had gone ahead of him all week. And out of the stationmaster's office came a man in a railway uniform, capped, bearded, hurrying, whose name deserves to be remembered as long as this story is told anywhere, Ivan Ozolin. Breathe out slowly once. The travelling part of this story is over. From here to the end, everything happens within 100 steps of where this train has stopped. They helped the old man down onto the platform at Astapovo, shaking with fever, leaning on his companions, and the lamps were lit and it was cold, and he would never board a train alive again. Chapter 19. A station called Astapovo. Ivan Ozolin was the station master at Astapovo, a Latvian by origin, a railwayman by career, a man in his late 30s with a wife and a house full of children, in charge of timetables, water, coal, and telegrams at a stop most passengers slept through. On the evening of the 31st of October, 1910, the evening train from the north handed him, without warning, the most famous dying man on earth. Consider his position for a moment, because this chapter belongs to him. No instructions cover this. No railway regulation in any empire has a paragraph for what to do when Leo Tolstoy, fugitive, excommunicated, adored, pursued by family and press and church and possibly the police, is carried shivering into your lady's waiting room, which is where they first laid him down on a bench under the timetable board, while the passengers of the halted train pressed at the windows to see. Ozolin could have done the correct thing, which was to wire his superiors and await orders, keeping the affair at arm's length on railway property off his own conscience. Middle managers of every century know that move. It is always available, nobody is ever punished for it. Instead, he gave them his house. It stood a short walk down the platform, a small wooden house, painted the dark red of railway buildings on that line, with white window frames, a little garden fence, rooms of no size at all. In it lived Ozolin, his wife, and their children. Within the hour, the family had cleared and given up the best room. A bed was made, and the old man was carried through the cold from the station, past the water tower, in through the little porch, and laid in a railwayman's bed under a railwayman's roof. When his companions tried to speak of payment, of trouble, of imposition, Ozolin waved it off with, in substance, one idea. It is an honor, the house is yours, as long as it is needed. As long as it is needed. Nobody in the room said how long that might be. The doctor knew and did not say, and the fever said it for him, hour by hour, through the first night. Let that house settle around you for a moment, because from here to the end of the story, this is the whole stage. 3 or 4 small rooms, a porch, lamplight, the garden fence, and beyond the fence, the platform, the rails, the telegraph office, and the enormous flat dark of the steppe in November. The scale of this story has been shrinking all week, if you have noticed. It began in a great white house on an estate, then a train carriage, then a convent cell, now a bedroom hardly bigger than the bed. As if the life were being distilled, reduction by reduction, toward whatever sits at the bottom of the cup. Feel how heavy your own limbs have grown, lying there. Let them be heavy. The story has stopped moving now. It has found its last room, and the room is warm. One more thing about Ozolin, and then the night can pass. He was not a Tolstoyan. He was not, so far as the record shows, anything in particular besides a decent railwayman with a crowded house. Of all the people in this story, the philosophers, the disciples, the family, the bishops, the correspondents of great newspapers, the one who acted instantly and without theory, exactly as the old man's own gospel of love would have him act, was the stationmaster of a coaling stop, who had read who knows how much of him and needed none of it to know what you do when a sick stranger is carried off a train at your door. You give them your bed. The teaching at its floor was never more complicated than that. The lamps of Astapovo burned late that night, and in the telegraph office down the platform a key had already begun to click. Chapter 20. The Stationmaster's house. The first night in the house set the pattern for all the nights that were left. The bed stood with its head to the wall in the cleared room, and around it the little party arranged what they had: Medicines from the doctor's bag, a basin, candles, the coat over a chair. Makovitsky sat close, counting the racing pulse, listening to the crackle in the old chest that told him the pneumonia was seating itself in the left lung. Sasha and Varvara took turns. Through the wall, the Ozolin children were kept quiet, and railwaymen's boots crossed the porch on tiptoe, and the water tower filled and emptied for trains that came and went all night. Because the timetable does not stop for anyone, not even for him. He was, that first night, lucid between the fever's climbs, and his lucidity worked at the only task it had ever known. He dictated. Propped on pillows, burning, he gave Sasha sentences for his diary and fragments of letters, and the sentences were about God, about love, about the impossibility of one man judging another. On the edge of the world, in a borrowed bed, the machine that had produced 90 volumes went on producing at a whisper. It is one of the most moving constancies in literary history, and also, if you have ever nursed a person whose lifelong habit would not release them even in illness, one of the most familiar. The hands keep reaching for the work. The work is the self by then. To set it down would be to set everything down. He also, in those first hours, gave instructions that tell you where his mind ran. No news to the newspapers. His whereabouts kept from his wife. The name he travelled under, T. Nikolaev, a thin disguise built from his own patronymic, maintained at the station. He wanted, even flat on his back, to be a private old man in a private bed. Through those first nights, the trains kept their schedule past the house, and word travelled with them. Passengers crowded to the corridor windows as their carriages slowed through Astapovo, pointing at the little red house with the lit window, and the house looked back at no one, keeping its secret in plain sight the way lit windows do. Somewhere aboard one of those trains, a traveller carried the story to a newspaper office, if the telegraph had not already outrun him. It was already far too late, and here the story turns a corner and becomes, for a few chapters, a story about all of us. Because the telegraph key down the platform had been clicking since evening. A railway telegraphist with knowledge of a lifetime's sensation under his hand is not a vault, and neither were the passengers of the halted train, who had scattered down the line carrying what they had seen. Within a day, the name Astapovo, which the morning's newspapers could not have placed on a map, was set in headline type in St. Petersburg and Moscow, and then Paris, London, Berlin, New York. Tolstoy ill at small station. The world rotated toward a red wooden house on the steppe, and the world in 1910 had recently grown new organs for exactly this. Wire services, half-tone photographs in daily papers, and the newest organ of all, the newsreel camera. Film crews, Pathy among them, were loading equipment onto southbound trains within days. The scholar William Nicol, who wrote a whole book on these 7 days and called it The Death of Tolstoy, makes the point that stands at the center of this part of the night. This was one of the first times in history that the death of a single human being was covered live by the mass media of the planet, hour by hour, bulletin by bulletin. The dying of one old man was about to become the first great modern media vigil, and the template it cut, the crowd at the barrier, the updates, the cameras aimed at a window, has never gone out of use since. Let your jaw soften. None of that noise can get into this room where you are lying, or, for one more night, into his. He slept at last toward morning, the doctor's hand on his wrist, the house breathing quietly around him, trains taking water in the dark outside. The 1st of November was coming. So was everyone else. Chapter 21. The wires begin to hum. By the 2nd of November, Astapovo had changed species. A coaling stop had become a capital. They came by every train. Correspondents of the Petersburg and Moscow dailies first, then the foreign press, stringers, photographers, and the film crews with their hand-cranked cameras and tripods like surveyor's gear. The station had one small telegraph office, and the queue outside it became a permanent feature of the platform, reporters standing in the cold, clutching dispatches, because the office that had handled a dozen railway messages a day was now carrying the world's front pages. Editors in London and New York held space nightly. In Russia, censors hovered over every line, for the government had its own anxieties about this death. The Interior Ministry was wiring for reports, and plainclothes police mixed with the journalists on the platform, watching the crowd, watching each other. A village of strangers assembled itself around the little red house. Reporters slept in railway carriages shunted onto sidings in the station hall, on floors of railway families' homes, paying step rents that would have amazed Moscow. The buffet ran out of everything daily. And twice a day, sometimes oftener, the doctors inside wrote out a bulletin in careful clinical Russian. Temperature, pulse, respiration, the state of the left lung, and it was posted at the station, and grown men ran with it to the telegraph queue, and within hours the pulse rate of one old man was being read aloud at breakfast tables on 5 continents. At the station itself, the bulletins had a second life. Many in the fence crowd could not read, and so those who could stood on the platform steps and read the doctor's careful sentences out slowly, translating them as they went into the older language of the village. He is no better, he is no worse. He passed a quiet night. Thanks be to God. News of the body, twice told, once for the wire and once for the sheepskin coats. Say it plainly. The man who had fled his house to escape being watched now lay at the exact center of the largest watching the world had ever organized around a single bed. He did not know. That is the mercy inside this chapter. The companions kept the newspapers from the sick room, kept the crowd's murmur explained away, kept the cameras out of his failing sight. In the bed, in the fever's valleys, he asked after the news of the world and was given weather and small talk. The world's news that week was him. There is 100-year-old question folded into this scene, and it has not aged a day. What did all those watchers want? Some wanted a story and were paid for it. Some wanted to witness history, to be able to say later, I was at Astapovo. The church wanted a repentance. The government wanted quiet. The Tolstoyans wanted a saint's death for the movement. The peasants who gathered at the fence, and they did gather, in sheepskin coats, standing for hours in the cold, wanted something harder to name, something closer to what draws villagers to sit with any dying neighbour, the sense that a great passing should not happen unaccompanied. And all of them together, the cynical and the reverent alike, were rehearsing something new under the sun. The whole world, connected by wire, holding its breath over one room. We have lived inside that arrangement ever since. It was invented, more or less, that week, on that platform, and the first person it was ever aimed at was a man whose entire teaching, reduced to one line, was that no human being should ever be turned into a spectacle for other human beings. Notice your breath, and let the noise of that platform fade behind it. In the little house, the shades are drawn. The clicking of the telegraph cannot cross the garden fence. We will stay outside those shades for one more chapter, because this crowd on the platform has something to teach, and it concerns you far more directly than it concerns Tolstoy. It is about being watched, and who is doing the watching, and what happened inside a psychology laboratory 90 years after Astapovo that measured, at last, the audience each of us carries in the dark. Hold the image of the crowd at the fence. Now turn it inward. Chapter 22. The Watched and the Watching. In the year 2000, at Cornell University, a psychologist named Thomas Gilovich ran an experiment that has become one of the quiet classics of the field. And it belongs in this story, strange as that sounds, because it is about the crowd at the fence, the one inside your head. Gilovich and his colleagues asked college students to put on an embarrassing t-shirt, a loud shirt with a face on it that no student would be caught wearing, and then to walk into a room full of their peers, stay briefly, and leave. Afterward, the wearers were asked, "How many people in that room noticed your shirt?" And the room was asked, "Did you notice?" And the wearers guessed that about half the room had clocked the shirt. The real number was closer to a quarter, sometimes less. The finding repeated in study after study: good shirts, bad hair days, brilliant remarks, embarrassing stumbles. We overestimate, roughly by double, how much other people notice us at all. The researchers named it the spotlight effect, the lifelong illusion that a beam follows us around the room, when in truth nearly everyone in the room is starring in their own private theatre, too busy with their own beam to operate ours. The audience we perform for, adjust our faces for, replay the evening for at 2 a.m. is mostly unstaffed. Its seats are empty. It always was empty. Decades of it. The remark you regret from years ago sits in almost no memory but yours. This is not a sad discovery. Taken slowly, at night, it is one of the most liberating facts psychology owns. Let it settle over you like a second blanket. Fewer people are watching than you fear. Fewer than you hope too, which stings for a moment and then frees. Now carry the spotlight back to Astapovo, because the old man in the red house is the great strange exception that proves the rule, and the proof runs in both directions. Tolstoy is one of the only human beings who ever lived for whom the spotlight was not an illusion. He guessed the world was watching him, and the world actually was. The queue at the telegraph office was counting his breaths. And notice what that condition, the condition the anxious part of you imagines all the time, actually did to a life. It made his house a stage and his marriage a performance review. It fed the part of him that curated his own goodness, the part his sharpest critics, and his wife in her hardest hours, called vanity. And it starved the part that only wanted to be a soul among souls. He fled to a coaling stop under a false name, T. Nikolaev, to get 1 week of what you and I are granted every single day and rarely notice we possess. The freedom of being nobody in particular, in a plain room, unobserved. The freedom you are lying in right now, in the dark, where no bulletin reports your pulse. And there is a second edge, quieter still. The audience Tolstoy could never dismiss was not really the crowd at the fence. It was internal, the watcher he called God or conscience, the eye before which he had drafted and redrafted himself since the age of 18, diary by diary. Each of us keeps some version of that inner spectator, assembled from parents, teachers, old loves, old shames. Much of what we call anxiety is stage fright before that empty house. The spotlight effect research whispers the way out. The theatre was always mostly dark, and the one review that ever mattered was always your own to write. Fewer people are watching than you fear. The sentence works at every scale but one, and in the next chapter, the exception arrives at Astapovo by special train. The one person whose watching he had never, in 48 years, learned how to bear. Chapter 23, The Special Train. Sophia learned where he was the way the rest of the planet did, from the newspapers. For 4 days she had been kept at Yasnaya Polyana, watched, medicated, half the time composing letters to him, tender ones and terrible ones, the other half questioning everyone who might know where he had gone. When the name Astapovo broke into print alongside the words gravely ill, the family stopped debating whether she should be told. The elder children gathered, Tanya, the sons. And the family did a thing possible only for the family of Leo Tolstoy. They chartered a special train, engine, and carriages from the nearest line and steamed south across Russia toward their father's deathbed with their mother aboard. Think of her at that carriage window through the long hours, 66 years old, days out from the pond, rocking across the steppe toward a husband who had left in the night specifically to be beyond her reach. Whatever she rehearsed in that carriage, apology, accusation, nursing plans, the words she had been storing for 4 days and 48 years, she rehearsed for a meeting that the men around the deathbed had already decided would not happen. The family, fearing for her as much as for him, had brought medical help of their own aboard, a doctor and a nurse for the 66-year-old woman whose last act at home had been the pond. So the special train carried in effect 2 patients toward one station. The dying man it was racing to reach and the desperate woman it was built around, each attended, each watched, neither told the whole truth about the other. There is no crueler diagram of this family's final years than the passenger list of that train, because at Astapovo the doctors and the companions had conferred, and their ruling was this: the sight of her might kill him. The shock, the scene, the old machinery of the marriage starting up at his bedside. His heart, they judged, could not carry it. It was medically reasonable. It was also, and both things are true at once, the same wall the household had been building around him for years now finished and manned. Chertkov, who had arrived by then himself, and Sasha, 26 years old, keeping her own mother from her own father's dying, certain, as the young are certain, that she was executing his deepest wish. Perhaps she was. He had said in the fever that Sophia must not come. He had also asked in the fever about her, whether she was well, what she was doing. The two Tolstoys, even now, even here. The special train drew into Astapovo on the 2nd of November and stopped on a siding and stayed. It became her home. She did not storm the house. She, who could have made the scene of the century with the world's cameras hungry at the fence, lived instead in the railway carriage 100 steps from his window and waited to be sent for. Life on the siding found its own small order. The carriage stove was kept in, the samovar went around. Her children moved back and forth between the carriage and the house, carrying bulletins softened for her hearing. She wrote to him. Notes crossed the 100 steps in other people's hands, and what came back thinned, second-hand, through the same intermediaries who kept the door. Let your shoulders drop. Feel where your own weight rests. This next part asks nothing of you but stillness. The days that follow belong, in the world's memory, to the bulletins and the great names. But the truest hours of the whole vigil happened between the carriage and the fence, where an old woman walked, slowly, several times a day, in her dark coat, along the frozen path beside the Stationmaster's garden. The reporters watched her. The film crews, and this fact will sting as long as the footage exists, cranked their cameras at her, because she was the only visible protagonist, the only Tolstoy the lens could reach. And she gave the lens, and the century, one image. You have been waiting for it since the first minutes of tonight. She walked to the house and stopped at the window. Chapter 24, The Window. If your mind has been drifting these last miles, that is fine. Come back gently now, just for this one chapter, because this is the image the whole night has been carrying toward you, and it deserves your last clear attention before sleep takes the rest. There is film of it. Grainy, silent, hand-cranked. A small woman in a dark coat and hat, no longer young, moving along the wall of a low wooden house. She reaches the window of the room where her husband is dying, and she stops, and she leans close, careful, the way one leans when one must not be seen. And she looks in through the glass at the bed she is not permitted to approach, at the white beard on the pillow, at her whole life lying 15 feet and one locked door away. Inside, lamplight, the doctor's murmur, the laboured breathing of the man whose pages she copied 7 times over. Outside, the step cold, the crank of a newsreel camera somewhere behind her, and 48 years pressed against a pane of glass. This is the window. I told you we would come back to it, and here we are, and here she is, and there is nothing to do now but stand quietly out here with her and refuse, one more time, to make her the villain the newsreel caption writers wanted. Look through the glass with her. She is not looking at a prophet, or at the conscience of the world, or at the author of anything. Those men belong to the crowd at the fence. She is looking at the person she married at 18 in a Kremlin church, the father of her 13 children, the hand she copied, the body she nursed, the man who, on their last anniversary, stood beside her in the garden, kind and stiff and already gone. The glass between her face and that bed is perhaps 1/8 of an inch thick. It might as well be the width of the marriage. The camera cranks. The century watches. She does not perform for it. She only looks, and then she straightens and walks on, along the fence, back toward the carriage on the siding, because it is cold and because there is nothing else she is allowed to do. The window goes on, glowing behind her. That strip of film still exists. It sits in archives now, transferred and restored, and people who have never read a page of him find it and watch a small dark figure lean toward a lit window for a few silent seconds, and something in the oldest part of the chest turns over. No caption is needed anymore. It is simply what love looks like when it has arrived too late and stands as close as it is allowed. Whoever you are, however your night is lying on you, you know some window of your own. Everyone past a certain age does. A distance that opened by degrees inside a house until two people who share a history could no longer reach each other across 6 inches of kitchen air. A person you could see clearly and not touch. If such a window stands somewhere in your years, let it be tonight. You do not have to fix it or even understand it. Stories like this one are not instructions, they are company. She stood there too, is all the story says. The cold was real and the lamplight was real, and both were true at once, and she bore it. Breathe. Let the image dim on its own schedule. Inside the room, they had drawn the curtain fuller when they realized the old man in the bed, drifting on the fever, never knew that face had been at the glass. Or so those present always maintained, and we will let them have it, because some mercies are best left unexamined. She would stand at that window more than once in the days remaining. The door it belonged to opens for her exactly once in this story, at the very end, and when it opens, we will go in with her. But not yet. Inside the house, in the small hours, the old man was still working, still dictating, still asking his last questions, and out on the dark platform, a monk from Optina was stepping down from the evening train. Chapter 25. The Monk on the Platform. The Russian Orthodox Church had excommunicated Leo Tolstoy in February of 1901, in a formal act of the Holy Synod read from 1,000 pulpits. The Count, it declared, had torn himself from communion by denying the Church's teachings, and until he repented, the Church's doors and rites were closed to him. He had answered in an open letter that he could not repent of what he believed true, and there matters had stood for 9 years. The most Christian-haunted writer alive, locked out of Christianity's Russian house, each side waiting with a kind of terrible patience for the other to blink. Now he was dying in a railway cottage, in public, with the world watching, and for the Church the moment was an agony of its own kind. If Tolstoy died unreconciled, it would be, in front of the entire planet, a defeat. Proof that Russia's greatest soul had gone into the dark, refusing them. But if he could be brought back, one word, one gesture, a hand not withdrawn from a cross, it would be the century's most resounding homecoming. Telegrams went out from church authorities urging repentance, appealing to him to return to the faith of his fathers before the end. And Optina Pustin, The monastery whose gate he had approached and not knocked at 8 days earlier sent a man in person, the elder Varsanofi, one of its most revered figures, a former army officer turned monk, carrying with him the authority to receive the prodigal home. He stepped down onto the platform at Astapovo and walked into the crowd of correspondents and got no farther than anyone else. The circle around the sick room, Sasha above all, with Chertkov beside her, refused him the door. Varsanofi asked, pressed, wrote a letter to Sasha personally. He wished only a few minutes, he said in substance, only to offer what the Church offers every dying Orthodox soul. Sasha answered, courteously and immovably, that her father's wishes were long known, that he had not asked for the Church, and that the family, meaning her wing of it, would not permit his last hours to become the scene of a conversion he had not sought. The elder remained at the station, lodged like the journalists, a monk among the newsmen, waiting near a door that never opened for him. In the little red house, the man in the bed was never told he had come. Was it right? Feel free to hold that question loosely and let it stay open. It has stayed open for 100 years. Those who barred the door believed to their marrow they were protecting his integrity, the entire meaning of his last 30 years, from being blurred at the finish by other hands. The monk on the platform believed a soul was being jailed by its own bodyguards at the 1 hour when every soul has the right to change its mind. Both believed they were serving him, neither could ask him. That is what the last days of a life are so often like, decisions made in corridors, in whispers, by the exhausted and the loving, on behalf of someone just beyond the reach of asking. The room does not answer. There is one more turn of this screw, and then we can leave the platform. Years earlier, in his diary and to friends, Tolstoy had imagined exactly this scene and dreaded it. He had said, in substance, that if, at the end, he should seem to waver toward the Church, it would only be illness speaking, and no such wavering should be believed. The bodyguards at the door were enforcing, word for word, his own instruction. And yet, an instruction written by a healthy man at a desk binds the dying man in the bed like a hand reaching out of the past to hold the door, and which of the two men had the better right, the one who wrote or the one who lay breathing, is a question philosophy has never settled and will not settle tonight. Let it rest. The elder said his prayers at the station for the man he could not reach. However the accounts differ, none of them doubts that the prayers were sincere. And inside the house, past the guarded door, the small hours went on, and they were, against every expectation this loud chapter has raised, remarkably gentle. Chapter 26, Small Hours in a Small House. Come inside now, past the porch, out of the cold. Close the door softly. This chapter stays entirely within the sick room, in the deep hours, the hours you yourself are approaching, when the platform noise died away and the house held only lamplight, breathing, and the scratch of a pencil. The days in the middle, the 3rd, 4th, 5th of November, kept a rhythm. Fever climbing at evening, easing toward dawn. Doctors now in numbers, the famous specialists having arrived by train from Moscow, listening to the ruined lung, injecting camphor and morphine against the pain, conferring in the kitchen in low voices while Ozolin's wife made them endless tea. The specialists had names the newspapers printed daily: Nikitin, who had been his personal physician in years past, and Birkenheim, and then the Moscow professors, Usov and Shkurovsky, summoned north to south as the bulletins darkened. Great men of the clinical world taking turns on kitchen chairs in a railwayman's cottage, listening through a wooden wall for the breathing to change. He greeted them in his clear hours with the mild irony he had kept for medicine all his life, and submitted to their stethoscopes like a patient old horse. Sasha at the bedside. Makovitsky, who barely slept that week, at the pulse, and the patient in his clear stretches, doing the two things he had done every day for 60 years, examining his soul and putting words in a row. On the 3rd of November, he made the last entry in the diary he had kept since 1847. He was too weak to write it all himself. Part he managed, part he dictated. It closed, the account books all agree, with an old French proverb he had loved his whole life, and since we are keeping faith tonight, with the rule that his exact words stay his, here it is, in plain English, in substance. Do what must be done, come what may. 63 years of self-examination, thousands of pages of resolutions, reproaches, prayers, and the ledger closes on 8 words a peasant could have said with one hand on a plough. He had spent a lifetime writing his way towards simplicity. In the end, weight for weight, he arrived. And there was another sentence in those days, reported by those in the room and repeated ever since, and it belongs here in the dark with you. To the family and doctors bent over him, adjusting, measuring, hovering, he said, in substance. There are millions of people suffering in the world, and you are all looking at one Leo. Reported speech, remember, carried out of that room by grieving people, and we flag it so. But it rings true to 60 years of him, and taken gently, it is not a rebuke at all. It is the last flicker of the thing that had driven the whole flight. The longing to stop being the exception, to rejoin the ordinary suffering species he had loved so fiercely and so awkwardly from inside his fame. To be, at last, one leaf on the enormous tree. Let your breath come slow. Lamplight, tea in the kitchen, a pencil set down. The house is very quiet now. He asked after Sophia in those days. More than once, was she well, who was caring for her, and told soothing half-truths. He let himself be soothed, or seemed to. Those at the bedside could never fully agree afterward about how much he knew, whether some part of him sensed how near she was, 100 steps, a pane of glass. The kindest reading, and the record permits it, is that both of them spent those last days doing the same thing from opposite sides of one wall, asking after each other through intermediaries, in a house too small and too watched for the only conversation that mattered. 48 years, ending in relayed questions. And yet, notice, the questions did not stop. Neither of them ever stopped asking about the other. Whatever had failed between them, and nearly everything practical had, the attention never failed. There is a bleak comfort in that, and tonight we will take our comforts where they stand. Tomorrow night brings the crisis. But before it, we owe ourselves the chapter this whole marriage has been waiting for, the one neither of them ever got to hear. It took psychology another half-century to find words for what was wrong in that house, and the words, when they came, turned out to be gentle ones. Chapter 27. The Space Between Two People. In the 1950s, an American psychiatrist named Murray Bowen began studying families, whole families at once, and came away with an idea that reads like a lantern held up to Yasnaya Pollyanna. Families, Bowen said, are not collections of separate individuals. They are single emotional units, webs of feeling in which anxiety travels like current, and each member's inner weather instantly becomes the other's weather. Anyone who has felt a whole household tighten because one person came home silent knows the phenomenon. The current is real. You have stood in it. And within that web, Bowen observed, every human being works out a balance between two needs that pull in opposite directions: the need to be close and the need to be a self. He called the mature balance differentiation, the capacity to stay warmly connected to the people you love while keeping your own thinking, your own convictions, your own inner ground, even when the current is surging. The poorly balanced positions he saw everywhere, and he saw that they come in pairs. Fusion, where two live so interpenetrate that neither can feel anything alone, and every difference registers as betrayal. And emotional cutoff, the dramatic exit, the frozen silence, the unanswered letters, which looks like independence and is actually fusion wearing a coat, because the person who must flee a relationship to keep a self is exactly as governed by it as the person who cannot leave the room. Distance, Bowen taught, is not differentiation. You can put 700 miles between yourself and a person and remain utterly fused to them, arguing with them in your head at every station. Now look back at the road we have traveled tonight and see how the lantern lights it. Two formidable people, married young, pour themselves into one enterprise so completely that the boundary between them wears through. His pages in her handwriting, her life inside his name. That is the fusion, and in the early lamplit years it feels like the very thing poetry promises. Then one of them changes root and branch, and the difference between them, which a differentiated pair could have held, registers instead as mutual betrayal, decade after decade. A third point enters, Shirtkoff, and the current, as Bowen's followers would later map in detail, triangles through him, so the two can fight about the disciple instead of grieving the distance. The diaries become instruments of fusion, each reading the other nightly, neither able to leave the other's head. And at last, at 82, comes the cutoff, the classic textbook. 5 in the morning flight, magnificent and desperate. 700 miles of step deployed to win a separation that was never geographical. Here, then, is the payoff of something planted hours ago, when I told you 2 men lived in that house under one name and asked you to hold the question of which one boarded the train. Bowen gives the answer, and it is quiet and a little heartbreaking. Neither. The Count stayed with the property. The prophet fled toward the peasants. But the passenger on that train was a third man, the unfinished one, the husband still fused at 82, to the wife he could not live beside, still arguing his case to her in the letters he drafted at Chamordino, still asking after her from the deathbed. He crossed half of Russia and never left the marriage for an hour. Nobody in that family ever cut the current. They only lengthened the wire. Let your hands soften. This is not a story about a monster and a saint in either direction. It is a story about voltage and about two people who never got the one thing Bowen Century would offer: a way to stand near each other without drowning, and apart from each other without fleeing. Whether such a balance can be learned late, and what the research on late reconciliation actually found, is a real question with a real answer, and it is waiting 2 chapters ahead. First, though, there are letters on the nightstand that have to be read, because the dying man in the small house was still, that very week, in correspondence with the future. Chapter 28, The Last Letters. 2 months before the flight, in September of 1910, from the last calm of Yasnaya Polyana, Tolstoy had written a long letter to a 40-year-old Indian lawyer living in South Africa. The lawyer had sought him out by mail the year before, troubled and ardent, organizing his people against racial laws and wrestling with the question of method. How does one fight enormous wrong without becoming wrong oneself? The old man had answered, and the correspondence had continued. And the September letter, one of the last long things Tolstoy ever wrote, poured out the distilled conviction of his final decades: that love is the highest law of life, that violence contradicts it root and branch, that resistance to evil must refuse evil's weapons, and that in this refusal, and nowhere else, lay the hope of the century then beginning. The lawyer's name was Mohandas Gandhi. He kept the letter all his life. He translated Tolstoy's writings, founded a community outside Johannesburg that he named Tolstoy Farm in the very year of Astapovo, and carried the doctrine of non-violent resistance into India and into history. Somewhere far down that chain of consequence stand names the old man never heard: Indian independence, an American preacher named King reading Gandhi in seminary, and every unarmed crowd since that has faced power holding nothing. The seed had older roots still, and Tolstoy knew them and named them. He had drawn deeply on the American Henry David Thoreau, the Concord surveyor who went to jail rather than pay a war tax and wrote Civil Disobedience in 1849. Thoreau to Tolstoy to Gandhi, 3 men who never once sat in the same room, handing one idea down a 100-year relay, each grip changing history. Hold the picture at its full width for a moment, because the contrast is the point. In the Red House at Astapovo lies a man who could not, by the testimony of this entire week, keep peace at one dinner table. From the same hands, in the same season, letters go out that will help unarm empires. Both facts are true, both are him. And if you have ever needed evidence that a flawed private life does not cancel a person's gifts to the world, or that world-sized gifts do not excuse a single unkind breakfast, here it is, complete, in 1 week of November 1910. The ledger does not consolidate. Each page stays itself. What a man is to history, and what he is to the person across the table, are 2 different accounts, audited by different angels, and the wise, growing old, try to keep both books honestly and stop expecting either to pay the other's debts. There was one book at that bedside that gathered the whole width of this chapter into a single object. In his last years, Tolstoy had compiled an anthology he called The Circle of Reading, a page of the world's wisdom for every day of the year. Epictetus beside the Gospels, Pascal beside Lao Tzu, Marcus Aurelius beside the Russian Proverbs. In the sick room he asked for it, and had the day's pages read to him, taking his own medicine at the end, a spoonful of other men's calm each morning. He had spent his last decade less as an author than as a relay station for the stillness of the dead. Now, in a railwayman's bed, it was being relayed back to him. Notice how still the room has become around you, letters folded, the lamp low. There is one more letter to mention, and it is the tenderest object in this chapter. Among the papers of those last days at Astapovo were lines he had begun at Shamordino to Sophia, the letter he never finished, interrupted by the 4 in the morning flight. In it, by the accounts of those who preserved it, he told her in substance that his leaving was not about lack of love. "Do not think," he wrote to her, "that I left because I do not love you." The sentence sat unfinished in a notebook while its author lay dying 100 steps from its addressee, and whether it would ever reach her, and what it could weigh against the locked door between them, the next chapters will tell. Some letters arrive too late by days, some by decades. The mercy is that they do, sometimes, still arrive. Chapter 29, 4 Things Worth Saying. Nearly a century after Astapovo, an American physician named Ira Byock, who had spent his working life in hospice and palliative care, sitting at more deathbeds than any novelist ever imagined, wrote down what he had learned there, and the heart of it fits in one sentence. At the end, the business that remains between people is almost never business. It is 4 short sayings. Please forgive me, I forgive you, thank you, I love you. Bayek had watched hundreds of times over what those 4 sentences do in a room where time is short. Estrangements decades old, he reported, could soften in an afternoon. Families locked for years in the kind of voltage we have been describing all night found, at the bedside, that the account books they had kept so bitterly simply stopped mattering, and that the 4 sayings, spoken plainly, even awkwardly, even late, changed the death and changed, more durably, the grief of everyone who survived it. The broader research of his field agrees in its sober way. Studies of the dying find that relationships, made right or left wrong, sit at the very center of what the end of life is actually about, and studies of the bereaved find that the words said and unsaid in the last days shape mourning for years afterward. Reconciliation at the end is not sentimentality. It is, the evidence says, among the most powerful medicine that exists, and it requires no prescription, only a door that opens in time. Now stand with that knowledge where this story has put us. In the cold, beside a railway carriage on a siding, 100 steps from a lamplit window. Every one of the 4 sayings was present at Astapovo that week. That is the quiet, staggering thing. Forgive me. It was in the letter on the desk at Yasnaya Polyana. In his own hand, I beg you to forgive everything I am guilty of in substance. Word for necessary word. I forgive you. There too, with his whole soul, he wrote, "Thank you, there, plainly, for 48 years of honest life. I love you," begun at Chamordino. "Do not think I left because I do not love you," and never finished. Everything Biok's dying patients labor toward was already written down by the one man in the story who could write anything, and all of it traveled by paper at a distance through intermediaries, while the woman it was addressed to stood at the glass, unable to hear one syllable of it in his voice. The four things were all there, only the room was missing. Let that rest in the dark beside you without pressing on it, because it is not, taken rightly, a bitter ending. It is the closest thing this story has to a letter addressed to you. The research is unambiguous about one more finding. The sayings do their work almost regardless of when they come, and the only version of them that heals nothing is the version that stays unspoken. Most of us are not at Astapovo, our windows still open. The people on the far side of our glass, and nearly everyone keeps someone there, a sister unspoken to, a father half forgiven, an old friend lost to one proud silence, can, as a rule, still be reached by ordinary mail, by a telephone, by a sentence begun badly at a kitchen table. Nothing tonight asks you to act. Night is not the hour for resolutions, and this channel makes no assignments. But if, as you drift, some face has quietly surfaced, you are allowed to let the four sayings pass once through your mind in its direction, silently, just as rehearsal. That costs nothing and disturbs no one, and by Biok's lights it is already a beginning. Please forgive me, I forgive you. Thank you, I love you. 16 words. The old man needed 90 volumes to reach them, and they sat in a notebook 100 steps from her window. Sleep is close now, perhaps. That is fine. What remains of this story is short and quiet, and you may keep or release it as your night decides. In the small house, the 6th of November was beginning, and the doctors had stopped speaking of recovery. Chapter 30. The 6th of November. If you are still awake, stay near me now, gently. These next 2 chapters are the still center of the whole night, and then the road turns for home. Through the 6th of November the fever burned higher, and the intervals of clearness grew shorter and further apart. The lung was failing. The heart, that old troubled heart, labored against it. The doctors, 6 of them now in the little house, injected their camphor and their morphine and looked at one another over the bed, with the expression physicians have worn in every century, the one that concedes the case to time. Bulletins went to the board and the wire. On the platform, the reporters wrote the word that editors were waiting for: sinking. Inside, those hours left behind a handful of sentences, murmured in half-consciousness, written down by the people at the bedside, and carried out of the room into 100 years of retelling. They are reported speech, remembered by the exhausted and the grieving, and tonight, as all night, we hold them at one respectful remove. But the record of them is consistent, and they sound like nothing on earth except him. He spoke of the peasants more than once in substance. The peasants, the peasants. How do they die? Even now, the question underneath all his questions, how the unfamous do this thing, plainly, without bulletins. At moments he struggled to rise, murmuring of getting away, of escape, as if somewhere beyond the bed there were one more train, one more third-class carriage, one more chance at the hut beside his sister's convent. And once, to his eldest son Sergei, who had arrived and sat close, a broken run of words that the family preserved and pondered ever after, to this effect: truth and I love much, I love all. The son wrote later that he could not be certain of every word. We will not pretend to be more certain than the son. Truth and love and the peasants and escape. 63 years of diaries compressed to 4 murmured themes, like a great house burned down to its 4 cornerstones. Feel the weight of your body where it lies. Let it be heavy. There is nothing to hold up anymore, for you or for him. Toward that evening, the resistance in him seemed, by every account, to loosen. The struggles to rise ceased. The breathing settled into the long-spaced rhythm the doctors knew. In the kitchen, Ozolin's wife kept the tea coming. On the siding, lamplight showed in the windows of the special train, where Sophia sat up dressed. Because word of the day's bulletins had reached her, and no one in her carriage pretended any more that she should rest. On the platform that evening, the crowd had changed character. The reporters still queued at the telegraph office, but along the fence, the sheepskin coats now stood in silence, hats off despite the cold, some with candles cupped against the wind, keeping the old vigil that villages have always kept outside the houses of the dying. Nobody organized it. Nobody ever organizes it. It assembles wherever it is needed, the way snow assembles on a sill. And around midnight, the doctors did the thing that doctors' silence does. They stopped guarding the door so hard. The family was sent for. The sons, Tanya. Decisions that had held for 6 days were dissolving hour by hour, because the reason for them, the fear of shock, the protection of a recovery, was dissolving too. There was no recovery to protect now. There was only the ancient etiquette of the last hours, which is older than medicine and stronger than doctrine, and which says, now the ones who love him come in, all but one. Even then, even at midnight, they made her wait, afraid the sight of her might rouse him to one final storm. She stood her post beside the carriage stove, 66 years old, waiting to be permitted. The permission came at last, in the smallest hours of the 7th of November, and it came, as such permissions so often do, a little later than Mercy would have set the clock. Chapter 31. The clock at 6:05. In the last hour before dawn, on the 7th of November, 1910, they opened the door of the sick room and let Sophia in. He was beyond waking by then. The morphine and the failing lung had carried him past the reach of voices, the doctors judged. And it was on that judgment, only on that judgment, that the door finally moved. She crossed a little room that she had seen for 6 days only through glass. She reached the bed. And the accounts of those present, and there were many present, the room was crowded with kneeling family, agree on what she did. She leaned close to the white head on the pillow, and she spoke to him softly. And what those nearest made out, in substance, was tenderness, that she was here, that she had been here all along, and words asking his forgiveness. She stayed by him, murmuring, her hand on him, an old woman at the shore of a half-century, saying the four things into an ear that no one can promise was still listening. Whether anything reached him, no science of 1910 could say, and ours cannot either. Those who study the dying tell us hearing is among the last senses to fade, and that the dying sometimes wait, past all explanation, for a voice or a footstep, and then go. Take that for exactly what it is, a kindness at the edge of knowledge, and set it beside the fact the record gives us plainly. She was with him at the end. After everything, the window had opened. The last voice of the marriage was hers, and it was gentle. Breathe slowly once, and let it go all the way out. The breathing from the bed spaced itself longer and longer again, the doctor's hands quiet on the old wrists, the room silent except for the small sounds a crowded room cannot help. Outside, the platform lamps were still burning against the last of the dark, and the correspondents stood along the fence in the cold, hatless, some of them already, watching the lit window as the sky behind the water tower went grey. At 5 minutes past 6 in the morning, the breathing did not resume. Dusan Makovitsky, who had opened this story being woken by a candle at the door and had barely left the bedside since, noted the time, and closed the eyes of Leo Nikolaevich Tolstoy, and the 6 days of Astapovo were over. For a long moment, the crowded room did not move. The doctors straightened slowly, the way men straighten after setting down a weight carried a long way. Sasha wept where she knelt. Sophia stayed bent over the bed, her hand where it had been, and no one, at last, had any reason left to move her. In his notebook, by lamplight, Makovitsky wrote the hour and the minute, finishing the record he had begun at a bedroom door 11 days before, the most faithful account any dying was ever given, closed now, like the eyes. Someone stepped out onto the porch, and the fence understood before a word was said, and men began to run through the grey light toward the telegraph office. And within the hour, bells and presses on 5 continents were saying one sentence in 40 languages. At the station, they stopped the clock. The big station clock at Astapovo was halted at 6:05, and it was never restarted. It stands so to this day. In the little town that now bears the name Leo Tolstoy, its hands holding the one moment out of all time that its platform was the centre of the world. A stopped clock, a lamplit window gone dark, and, on a siding, a special train whose engine would now be turned around. Let all of it be still for a moment. The story's work is nearly done, and so is yours. What remains is the going home, and it is gentler than anything since the first chapter. Chapter 32. The Train Going Home. Death did for the family what the living man's guarded door could not. It dissolved the camps. In the crowded little house there were now only mourners, and the oldest choreography in the world took over. The washing, the vigil, the candles, the low voices, while outside the press village began, article by article, to strike its tents. They dressed him plainly, as he had asked in his last testaments years before. No orders, no honours, the grey blouse of his last decades. Through that day the people of Astapovo, the railwaymen, their wives, their children, the peasants who had stood at the fence all week, filed through the small room past the bed, crossing themselves, some kneeling, saying goodbye to a man most of them had never read, because Russia does not require literacy to know whom it has lost. Ozolin's house had been a hospital for a week. It was a chapel for a night. The next morning, a plain oak coffin was carried out through the little garden to the platform, and here occurred one of those unplanned moments that history preserves better than any ceremony. The crowd at the station, students and peasants and railwaymen together, bared their heads, knelt on the boards, and began, untaught and unled, to sing the ancient Russian hymn for the dead, Eternal Memory. The authorities had feared demonstrations. The Church had forbidden its clergy to serve rites for the excommunicated man, and the crowd, in the space where the forbidden rites would have gone, simply sang the one thing everyone knew by heart. The coffin was placed in a freight car, and men decorated the car's plain boards with pine branches against the November grey. And the train drew out of Astapovo very slowly, past the stopped clock, through a corridor of bared heads. The railwaymen of the line had asked to make an offering of their own, and it was granted. Wreaths of pine and paper flowers, hand-lettered ribbons from the depot workshops, laid on the plain boards of the freight car by men in work coats who stood back afterward, caps in hand. Employees of the timetable, which had carried him to them by accident and was now carrying him home on purpose. It ran north through the day, and Russia stood along the line to watch it pass. At halts, crowds pressed to the freight car and sang. Police telegraphs clattered nervously up and down the empire. The government, which had feared the living Tolstoy's pen, feared his coffin nearly as much, and mounted guards at junctions as if an idea could be arrested at a level crossing. On the morning of the 9th of November, the train came to the little station of Zazheka, the halt nearest Yasnaya Polyana, where the whole road of this story had begun in the dark 11 days before. Thousands were waiting, peasants of the estate villages, students who had travelled all night from Moscow and Tula, delegations with wreaths. The coffin was lifted onto shoulders, and the procession set out on foot along the frozen road to the house, a slow river of dark coats 2 miles long under the bare birches, singing as it went. Let your body rest deep in the bed now. The hurry is entirely gone from this story. Everything left in it moves at walking pace, behind a coffin, going home. They carried him into the white wooden house and set the coffin in the room where the leather couch stood, the couch he had been born on 82 years before, and the peasants of Yasnaya Polyana filed past him all through the middle of the day in the rooms he had fled by candlelight. Sophia stood at the coffin in her own house, receiving the thousands, upright, spent, dignified, and whatever the newspapers had made of her that week, the villagers, who had known her 48 years, bowed to her as they passed. One walk remained, the shortest of all the week's travels. Out of the house, across the grounds, to the edge of the old forest called the Zakaz, where a grave had been dug at a spot the family knew without needing directions. You have known it all night too. It is time to go to the ravine. Chapter 33, The Edge of the Ravine. Do you remember the green stick? Hours ago now, at the beginning of the night, I asked you to hold it gently. The secret his brother Nikolai invented when Leo was 5 years old. The green stick buried at the edge of the ravine in the Zakaz forest, carved, so the game said, with the words that would end all anger and all suffering and make everyone love one another. The children who hunted it called themselves ant brothers. Nikolai died young, in his brother's arms, and the youngest ant brother carried the green stick through everything that followed, the wars, the novels, the fame, the conversion, the long ruin of the household, and asked in writing, decades before Astapovo, to be buried at the place where the stick was supposed to lie. On the 9th of November, 1910, they did exactly that. The procession came out of the house in the early winter dusk and crossed the grounds to the Zakaz, and there, at the edge of the little ravine, the grave was open in the black earth among the oaks. There was no priest. The church had held to its ban, and so the greatest funeral in Russia's memory went forward with no rite at all except the one the crowd had been inventing all along the railway line. Thousands kneeling in the cold leaves, bared heads, and the old hymn again, eternal memory, rising and falling under the bare branches until the earth was closed. No cross was set by his wish. No stone, no name. To this day the grave of Leo Tolstoy is what it was that evening, a plain green mound in a forest clearing the size of a man, without one letter of writing on it or near it. The most written man in the world lies under the only unmarked patch of ground he ever owned. Visitors still walk out to it from the house, down the same paths, into the same trees. They fall quiet, people report, at a certain point on the way, without being asked to. The clearing enforces its own register. There is nothing there to read, and so, for once, nothing stands between the visitor and the plain fact of a finished human life. He would have approved of that arrangement, the writer removed at last from between the reader and the truth. The forest is the signature. And so the story that began with a candle in a bedroom closes at a ravine where a 5-year-old once hunted the sentence that would fix the human heart. He never found the stick. Nobody finds the stick. But stand back from these 7 days, from the whole 82 years, and look once at the shape of the life entire. A boy is told that somewhere close to home the secret of universal love lies buried, and he spends one complete human lifetime digging for it, in novels, in gospels, in fields, in renunciations, in flight, and at the end his diggings have not found it, but have marked, for the whole species, an honest map of everywhere it is not, and 1 or 2 bright places where it might be. Then he lies down at the exact spot where the search began. Perhaps that is what the largest lives are. Not the finding, the thoroughness of the search, and the honesty of the map. The room does not answer. The forest does not either. Forests never do. That is their kindness. Let your breath grow long now. Snow found the clearing that first winter, as it has found it every winter since, and the mound sleeps under it, and the ravine keeps its old silence, and somewhere beneath the leaf mould, in the ground of a children's game, the green stick keeps its word by keeping it forever out of reach. The travellers of this story are nearly all home now. The train has stopped, the crowds have gone, the house at Astapovo has given the borrowed room back to the stationmaster's children. One person remains, and the last chapters of the night belong, as is only just, to her. Chapter 34, The 9 Years After. Sophia Tolstaya outlived her husband by 9 years, and the 9 years were quieter and kinder to her than almost anything in this story has been. She stayed at Yasnaya Polyana. Where else? The house was her life's work as surely as the novels had been his. She kept his rooms exactly as he had left them on the night of the candle, the study, the plain bedroom, the leather couch, so exactly that visitors a century later still see what she preserved. She sorted and copied and annotated, finishing her half of the great paper marriage, preparing her diaries and her memoirs, setting down her own account at last, not always fair, as no one's account of their own marriage is ever always fair, but full and human, and there for history to weigh beside his. Pilgrims came up the drive, as they had come when he lived, and she received them and walked them through the rooms, the widow of the estate showing strangers the desk, the couch, the path to the grave in the zakars, and she walked to the ravine herself, regularly, in all weathers, an old woman in black crossing the grounds to stand at the unmarked mound. The war and then the revolution arrived in those years. The world of counts and estates dissolved around her. Soldiers and new authorities came and went. The house survived, protected in the end by the name it carried, by the grave at the edge of its forest. Those who spoke with her in the last years recorded a woman gentler than her legend, still turning the marriage over, still asking it questions. One remark of hers from those years is repeated in many memoirs in slightly differing words, and we hold it as we have held every remembered sentence tonight, at one respectful remove, reported, not recorded. In substance, she said, I lived with him for 48 years, and I never really learned what kind of man he was. From anyone else, that would be a confession of failure. From her, after everything this night has shown you, it lands differently. It may be the most honest sentence anyone in this entire story ever said about another human being. 48 years, 13 children, 7 copyings of War and Peace, and the other person remains. At the end, a country she had lived in all her life and never fully mapped. That is not the failure of one difficult marriage. That is the actual condition of human closeness, said out loud by a woman brave enough to stop pretending otherwise. We do not finish knowing anyone. We are not finishable. The love that lasts is the love that makes its peace with being, always, partly, in the dark. Let that be true, gently, of every bed and every house tonight, including yours. She fell ill in the autumn of 1919, pneumonia, the same quiet drowning that had taken him, and she died in November 9 years almost to the week after Astapovo in the house, with her daughters near her, Tanya and Sasha, the same Sasha who had guarded the door against her. The two women had made their peace in those last years. The daughter, grown older herself, had come to see her mother. And the war between them, like most family wars, did not survive the people it had been about. Sophia was buried not in the forest clearing, but in the family plot at the village churchyard nearby, with rites with her church, as she would have wished. So they lie a walk apart to this day, he at the ravine with no name over him, she in the churchyard under hers. The last 100 steps of a distance the two of them measured all their lives. And what are the people who love a Tolstoy supposed to do? The question this story has carried since the first chapter. She gave the only answer there is, and it took her 57 years. Everything she could, imperfectly, at great cost, without ever fully understanding, and longer than anyone else on earth was willing to. Whoever keeps loving past the edge of understanding is not the lesser figure in the story. Tonight, at least, let the record show it. Chapter 35. What the 7 days ask. The story is told now. What remains, before the house lights go all the way down, is to sit for a few minutes with what it asks, because the 7 days of Astapovo have been putting one question to every generation since 1910, and it is worth hearing clearly once, in the calm, at the edge of sleep, the mocking version of the question you have heard all your life. He preached simplicity from a manor house. What a hypocrite. The mockery is cheap, and you have earned the better version tonight. Here it is. If a man of that stature, with that sincerity, working at his own soul daily for 63 years, with a fury of honesty no one doubts, still could not close the gap between what he believed and how he lived, then what is the gap? And what should the rest of us, who work at our souls on Sunday evenings at best, expect of ourselves? The psychologist Erik Erikson, mapping the seasons of life half a century later, called the last of them a reckoning between integrity and despair. The old person looks back over the one life actually lived and either finds a way to hold it whole, contradictions included, or turns from it in bitterness. What the 7 days show is that this reckoning is not a bookkeeping exercise that comes out even for the great. Tolstoy at 82 was still mid-struggle, still fleeing toward his ideals with his contradictions in his luggage. And the tradition he loved knew why. Montaigne, whom he read and reread, had said in substance that to philosophize is to learn how to die, and meant by it that the learning is never finished, only practiced. Seneca, tutor of emperors, wrote streams of advice about calm he could not always keep in his own villas, and knew it, and said the work was the point. William James, who put Tolstoy's Crisis into the textbooks, taught that the divided self is not a scandal but a stage, and that some souls stay in the dividing their whole lives and are not thereby failures. They are simply the honest ones. Set the standard where the evidence sets it. The gap between creed and life does not close. Not for him, not for the elders at Optina, not for you. What the great and the honest do with the gap is not eliminate it, but keep faith with it keep walking toward the better half of themselves at whatever age, on whatever road, even one that ends at a coaling stop. The failure would have been to stop walking, to let the manner win quietly, to die at ease in the contradiction with the curtains drawn. Whatever else the flight from home was, confused, late, cruel in its collateral, it was not that. At 82, 10 days from death, the man was still trying to become what he believed. You are allowed to find that ridiculous. The century, on the whole, has found it magnificent, and the tenderest readers find it both, because it is both, and for you, the standard turns merciful exactly here. If the gap does not close for a Tolstoy, then the gap you carry between the person you meant to be and the person your years actually shaped, between what you know about love and what you managed at your own tables, is not your private disgrace. It is the species' oldest weather. You have not failed at a task others complete. You are mid-practice in a discipline no one masters, and the practice itself, Montaigne's word, the daily walking toward the better half, is the entire achievement. There was never another one on offer. Let your whole body go loose now, limb by limb, at whatever pace it chooses. The 7 days ask one thing more, and then they are done asking. They ask you to notice the Stationmaster. In a week crowded with genius, doctrine, cameras, and grief, the one act that needed no correcting afterward, no biography to defend it, was Ivan Ozolin's. A tired man with a full house who saw a sick stranger and gave up his bed. Every philosophy in this story, pressed hard enough, reduces to that. Most of the time, so does yours. The night is nearly over. One short chapter remains, and it is not really a chapter, it is just the house, going quiet. Chapter 36. The Quiet House. Come back, one last time, to where we began. A dark bedroom, a house gone still, a person lying awake, listening, while the oldest thought there is passes through. I could leave. I could just walk out the door and be someone simpler somewhere else. You have followed that thought as far as it goes now. You have seen it walk out of a white house with a lantern, lose its hat in the orchard, ride third class among strangers, stand 3 steps from a monastery gate, drink tea with a sister, run out of road at a coaling stop on the step, and lie down in a stationmaster's bed. You know now where the door out of one's own life leads. It leads to a small room very much like the one left behind, with a lamp and a window and the same unfinished heart carried the whole way. So let the thought pass tonight as it always passes, not because the door is locked, because you have seen the whole road, and the road is already here, in this room, in the dark, where the work of loving imperfect people imperfectly goes on at close range, which is the only range it was ever really available at. And if some night the thought returns, as it will, let it come in and sit on the edge of the bed a while. It is not an enemy. It is only the part of you that remembers you are larger than your circumstances, paying its small visit the way an old friend looks in without needing anything. Let it visit. Let it go. The old man himself could tell you now, from his clearing, the door was never the way. The way is shorter than that. It was always about the length of an arm, the width of a table. The distance to the next room, where someone imperfect is sleeping. The house is quiet now. Every loop of this long story is closed. The window at Astapovo opened at last in the smallest hour. A hand resting on him, a soft voice. The four things said. The two men who shared one name, at peace, both of them, under one green mound, neither one the winner. The argument finally set down like a heavy case at the end of a platform. The green stick, still buried, still keeping the secret, exactly where a 5-year-old was told to look for it, exactly where the old man chose to lie down and stop looking. And the stopped clock at the station says 6:05 forever, and the town around it bears his name, and the trains still pass, slowing slightly, as trains do at small stations, before running on into the dark. Astapovo keeps its museum in the little red house now, the bed made, the lamp lit in the window on winter evenings. Yasnaya Polyana keeps the study, the couch, the 2 white towers by the drive. The world kept everything, in the end. It always keeps more than we think it will. He spent 50 years telling the world how to live simply, and one night trying to do it. Let that be the sentence the night keeps. Your body is heavy now, let it be heavy. The blanket is warm, the room is safe. Nothing is asked of you. Whatever doors your life holds, they will keep until morning. Whatever windows, there is time. The people on the far side of the glass are sleeping too. Let the story go now. Let the station lamps go out one by one. The steppe is white and endless and soft. The snow is falling on the Zakaz forest, on the clearing, on the quiet mound, filling the ravine where children once hunted the secret of love. Maybe they came closest. The children. Ant brothers, under a shawl-draped chair, huddled close, practicing tenderness. Close your eyes. The house is quiet. The lamp is out. Sleep now.